Today's podcast features 3 medical horror stories. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Green Needles, and it's about a man who went to the emergency room with extreme chest pains. The second story you'll hear is called Midnight Stroll, and the idea that this actually happens to people is truly terrifying, both for them and the people near them. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Trauma Room 1, and it's about a woman who arrived at a hospital, and just seconds later, the entire hospital was evacuated. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak in to the Amazon Music follow button's house and set all of their clocks back 1 hour. Okay, let's get into our first story called Green Needles. A 28-year-old Russian man named Artyom Sidorkin started having severe chest pains, and at first he tried to ignore it, but it got so bad he could barely stand up, and then he began coughing up blood, and so finally he went to the emergency room. When he got there, even before the doctors examined him or gave him an x-ray, just based on the way he presented to them, being pale in the face and hunched over and very sick looking, they assumed this must be something very serious. So that day, they brought Mr. Sidorkin in for an examination, and after talking to him and hearing about all of his symptoms and just looking at him, the assumption was he probably has a tumor in his lungs. And so they sent him in for an x-ray, and afterwards the radiologist looked at the x-ray and confirmed that, yep, there is a mass growing inside of your lungs. And so before they went to just start removing huge pieces of his lung, they told him that they would like to do a biopsy where they remove a small piece of the tissue and test it to see if it's cancerous or not. And so Mr. Sidorkin is terrified, but he says okay, he schedules his surgery, he goes in a couple days later, and the surgeon pulls out a piece of his lung tissue, and as it's sitting on the tray, he looks down at the tissue, the surgeon does, and he realizes there's something hidden inside of the tissue, as if the tissue was like an envelope holding something inside of it. And so he opened it up, and there, growing on the side of his lung, was a small fir tree. It was 5 centimeters long, it was green, it looked very lively, it was just a thriving little tree. The doctors believed Mr. Sidorkin, who was a botanist, had inhaled a seed of a fir tree, and it got lodged inside of his lung tissue. And then as it grew, its pine needles began piercing his blood capillaries, causing him to cough up blood. After the discovery of what was inside of his lung, a spokeswoman for the Royal Botanic Gardens in London said that it is possible for a seed to germinate inside of the dark, damp conditions inside of a lung, but it is unbelievably bizarre. When doctors informed Mr. Sidorkin that he did not have cancer, he had a tree, Mr. Sidorkin was shocked, and he said, "I never got the sense that there was a tree growing inside of me." But more than shocked, he was just relieved that he was cancer-free. There is a picture of this tree inside of his lung tissue, but it's a bit graphic, so if you want to see it, go ahead and Google tree and lung, and I'm sure you'll find it. Our next story is called Midnight Stroll. In 1887, 35-year-old Robert Ledru was a very talented detective working in Paris, France. He was so talented that periodically he would get called upon by other police departments around the country to help them solve their most difficult cases. And so that year, there was this coastal town in northern France that had this string of sailors that went missing, and nobody had the slightest idea what had happened to them. And so naturally, Robert was called in to investigate. The night Robert arrived in this town, it was very late and Robert was tired, so he went straight to his hotel and he went to bed. The following morning, he got up and he went straight to the local police department to meet the local officers that he would be working with on this investigation. But when he got there, he was told that the missing sailors case had been lowered in priority because during the night, a murder had been committed down on their beach, and so that was now their main focus. And so they apologized to Robert and said, I'm sorry you came all this way for nothing, but since you're here, do you want to help us in this beach murder investigation? And Robert said, sure. The victim was a middle-aged man named Andre Monet who owned a dress shop in Paris, France. He had recently moved to this coastal town to enjoy the beautiful scenery. When his body was discovered early that morning, it was quickly determined he had been killed by a single gunshot wound to the chest, where the bullet actually went clear through him out the other side, but they hadn't found the bullet. There were no suspects, there were no leads, there was no clear motive. However, they were able to rule out robbery because there was still money in Andre's pockets. And so Robert and the other local officers left the police station and made their way down to the beach, where they began examining the area where Andre had been found. The local officers focused on looking for the bullet, while Robert decided to walk a little ways down the beach to see if there was any evidence that had been overlooked in the initial search. And after only walking a very short distance, Robert noticed some barely visible footprints that appeared to pass right by where Andre's body had been found. And these footprints, they continued past that area and then up a flight of stairs up onto the road where they disappeared. Robert called over the other officers and told them to make plaster casts of these footprints so he could analyze them. What that meant is the officers would literally just pour liquid plaster inside of these prints, and then when they dried, they would pull that plaster out and it would literally be a 3D model of the foot that had made the prints. And so as the officers are working on these casts, Robert says to one of the officers that these prints looked really odd to him, like they were familiar in some way, but he just couldn't place where he had seen them before. Less than an hour later, when the plaster had dried, the officers pulled them out and they handed them to Robert. And as soon as Robert looked at them, he physically reacted to what he was seeing. It was like he was disappointed. And then without saying anything, he just walked down the beach with these plaster casts until he got to this secluded area where he sat down. And he sat there for hours and hours, just staring at the plaster casts, seemingly unaffected by the sun that was blazing down on him the whole time and the tide that was very quickly creeping up on him. The local officers who were watching this, they didn't know anything about Robert. All they knew is his reputation, which is he is this totally legendary detective, and so they didn't dare question his methods, even though this seemed really odd what he was doing. Finally, by mid-afternoon, Robert would put the cast down, he would stand up, and he would walk back over to the mystified local officers. And when he walked up to them, he would say, "There's no reason to stay at the beach any longer or interview any more witnesses. I think I've solved the case." But then instead of elaborating, he just turned around and walked up off the beach and headed back for his hotel. The local officers just looked at each other and shrugged, and they left too. Early the next day, the bullet that had killed Andre Monet was found on the beach. And so when Robert showed up to the beach, the chief of police handed him this bullet in an effort to help him continue the investigation. And as soon as Robert looked at it, he sighed and said, "Okay, now I know for sure what happened." And then Robert proceeded to break down the murder. He said the killer woke up in the middle of the night on the night that Andre was killed, and he got out of his bed, he put on his clothes, and then he headed down to the beach. There, he encountered Andre Monet, a man he didn't know who was most likely out for a midnight stroll as well. The two men struck up a friendly conversation, but at some point it turned into some sort of quarrel, at which point the killer drew his pistol, shot Andre in the chest, and then fled the scene. Robert told the local police chief that the reason he knew all these details is because he had been the killer. He killed Andre Monet. But he didn't do it on purpose, and he didn't remember, because he killed Andre Monet while he was sleepwalking. He told the chief when he was given those plaster casts of those footprints, he knew immediately why he thought those prints looked so familiar. Because as soon as he looked at the casts, he could tell whoever had made the prints was missing a toe, and as it happened, Robert was missing a toe. So those prints looked exactly like his footprints. And that morning, when he had woken up in his hotel room before even going down to the beach, he had noticed that his shoes and his socks, which were next to his bed, were sandy and damp. And he thought that was so strange because he couldn't remember how they got that way, but he was too busy to investigate. And that night, after he had sat all day looking at the casts and then left the beach, leaving the local police officers totally mystified, he had gone back to his room, and the first thing he did was get his revolver out from under his pillow, and he discovered that one bullet was missing, and he always kept his revolver fully loaded. And so he spent the rest of the night trying to convince himself that this was just one big coincidence. But the following morning, when he was given that bullet, he knew immediately that this was not a coincidence. The bullet that had killed Andre Monet was the same type of ammunition that he loaded his revolver with, and so he had to be the killer. He had effectively caught himself. The police were totally shocked and did not believe this at first. More specifically, they didn't want to believe that Robert, their star detective, was behind this horrible homicide. But eventually, after examining all the evidence, they agreed he had to be the killer. But to test whether this really was sleepwalking and not some elaborate cover-up by Robert, they decided to conduct an experiment. Robert, who was fully cooperative with the investigation, was told to sleep in this jail cell where he would be monitored 24/7 by armed guards, and in this cell with him would be a revolver loaded with blank rounds. He was told to keep it under his pillow. For the first couple of days, nothing happened. Robert never touched the revolver during the day or when he was asleep. But about a week into this experiment, Robert suddenly woke up in the middle of the night in this trance-like state. He reached under his pillow, pulled out the revolver, and began firing at the guards right outside of the cell. And so this convinced the police that Robert had been telling the truth about what happened to Andre Monet. He really had killed him while he was sleepwalking. A decision was made not to prosecute Robert for the murder. Instead, they decided to basically exile him for everybody's protection. And so from then until 1937, when Robert died, he was forced to live alone on this secluded farm outside of Paris, where the only visitors he ever got were doctors who would only show up during the day and with armed bodyguards. The next and final story of today's episode is called Trauma Room 1. On the night of February 19th, 1994, a man in Southern California called 911 because his girlfriend was struggling to breathe. When the 911 dispatcher picked up this man's call, he was very distraught and asked them to please send an ambulance as fast as you possibly can. But despite how upset this man was on the phone, he was not actually surprised this situation was unfolding. His girlfriend, 31-year-old Gloria Ramirez, had been diagnosed with terminal cervical cancer just 6 weeks earlier, and the doctors had told her that she likely did not have much time left. And making this even more tragic, Gloria had actually gone into the hospital a few years earlier with symptoms and signs that she likely had cancer, but the doctors missed it. Had they caught it back then, they likely could have saved her. Still, after receiving her very grim diagnosis just a few weeks earlier, Gloria had resolved to fight her cancer as best as she could. After all, she had a lot to lose. Gloria had 2 young kids. She had a boy and a girl who were 9 and 12 years old respectively. And Gloria absolutely adored them and really devoted her life to them. In the evenings, she would play with them and help them with their homework, and the whole time she'd be cracking jokes to make them laugh and smile. And then even when Gloria was not actively parenting her kids, she was always a very positive presence in their lives. She was optimistic, she was happy, she was upbeat, and oftentimes she could be found wandering around with a big smile on her face, singing a religious hymn to herself. So, when Gloria got this terrible news that she had late-stage cancer, she was obviously terrified and sad, but she was also very determined to find a way to survive because she knew her kids still needed her. Around the time Gloria was diagnosed, her doctors told her she would begin radiation treatment for her cancer at the end of February, so she had a few weeks to wait. And so during this waiting period, Gloria found herself spending a lot of time researching her disease, looking for things she could be doing on her own right now to make herself feel better or even potentially increase the odds of her survival. So on February 19th, when Gloria told her boyfriend that she was starting to have some issues breathing, the boyfriend didn't hesitate for a second to call 911 because he knew firsthand from living with Gloria that she was desperate to survive. And so any changes in her symptoms needed to be treated like an emergency. It was around 8 p.m. that night when the ambulance pulled up in front of Gloria's home. Paramedics climbed out, they rushed over to Gloria, they put her on a stretcher, they gave her a mask with oxygen, and then they loaded her into the back of the ambulance, and then seconds later, they were flying down the road with their sirens blaring. While they sped toward the hospital in Riverside, which is a city about an hour east of Los Angeles, one of the paramedics on board the ambulance called ahead to the Riverside Hospital emergency room to talk to one of the doctors. And the doctor who answered was a 33-year-old woman named Dr. Julie Gorczynski. And she loved her job. She loved the thrill and excitement and challenge of working in a big city emergency room. And so she takes this call. The paramedics tell her that they have a patient who has terminal cancer. She's having a hard time breathing, and her heart rate is becoming very unstable to the point where if it's not controlled soon, it's going to kill her. And they told Julie they would be there in about 5 minutes. And so Julie, she hangs up the phone and immediately began preparing for receiving a critical patient, as well as getting trauma room 1 ready, which is where Gloria would be treated. Now, as bad as this situation was for Gloria, for Julie and the other nurses and doctors in this emergency room, this was kind of business as usual. They were used to receiving patients that were in very rough shape. And so as Julie and the rest of her medical team waited for this ambulance to arrive, none of them were worried that they wouldn't be able to handle this patient. They thought tonight was going to be as routine as any other night. However, they would be very, very wrong. The ambulance ride took about 15 minutes, so they pulled into the Riverside Hospital right at 8:15 p.m. And as soon as the ambulance came to a stop, the paramedics jumped out, they ran around to the back, they opened up the back doors, they pulled Gloria out still on her stretcher, and they pushed her as fast as they could through the doors into the emergency room. Once inside, Julie and the rest of her team, they took Gloria and they pushed her left down a hallway into trauma room 1. Once inside, the doctors and nurses immediately noticed that Gloria's heart rate was spiking dramatically and her blood pressure was falling dramatically. So Julie and her team began administering a standard set of treatments for someone in this condition. They switched Gloria's oxygen mask she had been using on the ambulance ride for a more powerful one. They gave her painkillers, sedatives, and drugs to help steady her heartbeat. And at first, the treatments seemed to be working because pretty quickly Gloria's heartbeat began to level out. However, it didn't last. Soon, Gloria's heartbeat was racing so insanely fast that all of these alarms were going off on her heartbeat monitor. Knowing they had to act quickly, Julie and her team began removing Gloria's t-shirt in order to administer electric shocks to her chest with paddles. This is a way for doctors to kind of reset a patient's heartbeat. As the nurses got the electric paddles ready, they and the rest of the medical team suddenly noticed 2 strange things about Gloria. The first was that Gloria seemed to be emitting this strange garlicky smell from her mouth. The second was Gloria's skin looked very greasy. However, despite the entire medical team taking note of these 2 things, no one thought they were significant. Lots of patients suddenly are brought into the ER, and very rarely do they have a chance to shower or brush their teeth beforehand. And so they figured that was the reason she looked and smelled that way. Finally, the big electrical paddles were ready, and so the nurses placed them on either side of Gloria's heart, and then they began sending powerful bolts of electricity into Gloria's chest. While the nurses worked on Gloria's heart, other members of the medical team needed to assess Gloria's overall condition. And so to do that, they needed to draw her blood. So a nurse took an alcohol wipe and cleaned a small spot on Gloria's arm, and then she took a syringe and jabbed it inside of Gloria and began the draw. And as soon as she did this, trauma room 1 filled with a new smell. It was a chemical smell. And Julie immediately noticed it, and she looked over at the nurse doing the blood draw, and she said, "I think it smells like ammonia in here." And the nurse, who was doing the blood draw, kind of scrunched her face up in disgust and nodded in agreement. The nurse finished the blood draw and then handed the blood vial to Julie. And as Julie was taking this blood vial from the nurse, she noticed the nurse looked suddenly very confused and very disoriented. Her eyes were kind of flickering and she was staring straight ahead like she didn't know where she was. And so Julie, she sees this in the nurse, and then she glances down at this blood vial in her own hand now, and she sees something she's never seen before. The blood inside this vial, Gloria's blood, was full of these small white crystals. But before Julie could tell anybody else in the room about these strange crystals in the patient's blood, the nurse who had done the blood draw went from being dazed and confused to collapsing on the ground. Luckily, another doctor had seen the nurse starting to collapse and dove out and caught her right before her head hit the ground. This collapsed nurse was very quickly placed on a stretcher and wheeled out of Trauma Room 1 so the other doctors and nurses could focus on Gloria, who was obviously dying. And so Julie, who was still just standing in the middle of this room holding this vial of blood, was wondering what the heck just happened to her colleague, and she's also looking down at these crystals thinking, I've never seen this before, what does this mean? And right as she was about to flag one of the other medical team members over to look at it, Julie began feeling very nauseous and her head started spinning, and then she felt like she might collapse, and so not wanting to cause any more distractions for the main team, she quickly placed this vial of blood on a nearby tray, and then she quickly made her way out of Trauma Room 1 and sat down in a nearby chair. And as soon as she sat down, another staff member at the hospital who had not been inside of the trauma room ran over to Julie and asked her, hey, are you okay? And Julie, she looked up at the staff member and she tried to speak, but she couldn't. And then her eyes rolled back into her skull and she slumped forward and fell to the ground. And at the same moment that Julie was collapsing outside of Trauma Room 1, inside of the trauma room, there was another thud as another nurse collapsed, and then another, and then another. And before long, screams were coming out of Trauma Room 1 as people inside who had not collapsed yet are looking around, seeing their colleagues just dropping like flies for no reason. And so pretty quickly, the call came out over the hospital intercom to evacuate the hospital. The only people that would stay back would be a skeleton crew of doctors and nurses and Gloria, because they felt like moving Gloria outside right now would likely kill her. We need to save her right now. Outside the hospital, the parking lot very quickly filled up with doctors and nurses and other sick people on stretchers. People were screaming and crying, sirens were blaring, and the medical staff that was still healthy was running all over the place looking for supplies to help treat their coworkers. Meanwhile, back inside of Trauma Room 1, things for Gloria only seemed to be getting worse. The 4 doctors and nurses who had stayed back continued to administer more drugs, more shocks to her chest, more oxygen, but no matter what they did, her blood pressure continued to fall, and her heartbeat became fainter and fainter and fainter. Finally, at 8:50 p.m., roughly 35 minutes after Gloria had first been wheeled into the emergency room, she died. In that 35-minute window, 23 of Riverside Hospital staff had either collapsed or become very sick and then collapsed, and many of them had to be hospitalized. But the most affected person by far was Julie. She was in such bad shape by the time she made it out to the parking lot that she was actually put on an ambulance from her hospital and driven to another hospital where she was admitted to their intensive care unit. And there, a nurse drew her blood, and in it were little white crystals, just like in Gloria's blood. At 11 p.m. on the same night all this craziness happened, a hazardous materials team dressed in full hazmat suits entered the Riverside Hospital to look for a chemical leak, because that was the running theory that some sort of leak had happened in the hospital, it had made its way into Trauma Room 1, and that's what had caused everyone to collapse and get sick. But despite an extensive search, the hazmat team did not find any leaks. Stumped, authorities decided to just be extra careful around this hospital and around Gloria's body until they figured out what had happened, because the fear was there was some sort of unknown or hidden toxin either in this building or on or in Gloria's body. 6 days after the incident, inside of a special airtight room while wearing full body protective suits, doctors performed an autopsy on Gloria. And they discovered there was absolutely nothing toxic inside of her. In fact, the autopsy only revealed that Gloria had died of natural causes. Her cancer had caused her heart and her kidneys to fail. Meanwhile, although the other medical staff members who had gotten sick inside of Trauma Room 1 had mostly recovered, Julie just could not seem to get any better. She had breathing problems and pancreatitis, which is the inflammation of the pancreas, and it's very painful, and her bones were literally just starting to die, leaving her in a wheelchair. Gloria's family blamed Riverside Hospital for Gloria's death, insisting that these toxic fumes that must have been present inside of Trauma Room 1 came from the hospital, and those fumes are responsible for what happened to the staff, and they are responsible for killing Gloria. And in fact, 3 times in the 3 years leading up to Gloria's death, Riverside Hospital had had some issues with hazardous materials making their way into the hospital. There was sewer gas that came in from a drain. There was a toxic gas that was created from a sterilizer that made 2 people in the hospital sick, and some of the hospital's water was found to have algae in it. But the hospital said they checked their hospital, there was no leak, we did not cause whatever toxic fumes were inside of Trauma Room 1, and so we are not responsible for what happened to our staff or what happened to Gloria. Riverside Hospital would be searched again and again for some sort of leak. Also, Gloria's home would be searched for toxic gases, and Gloria would be autopsied 2 additional times. But no one could find anything toxic anywhere. So, eventually, California's Department of Human and Health Services came forward and said they had the answer to what had happened inside of Trauma Room 1. They said it was mass sociogenic illness. Mass sociogenic illness is when a group of people all believe they have the same illness, even though there's nothing wrong with any of them. It's caused by fear and anxiety. Basically, the state of California was saying that Julie and the other 22 staff members who had gotten sick and collapsed had just pretended they were making it up. As for Gloria, they said she just died from her cancer. Now, of course, this explanation made a lot of people unhappy, like Gloria's family, and of course Julie, whose medical problems were very well documented. She couldn't walk anymore because her bones were literally dying. And so, Gloria's family and Julie said, you know what, we think the hospital is covering something up, and we are going to sue. But before they did, an obscure lab located just outside of San Francisco, California, it was called the Forensic Science Center, was called in to do yet another investigation into what happened inside of Riverside Hospital. And what these scientists found would make history. Here is what they discovered. After Gloria was diagnosed with cancer, she began researching not only her disease, but also alternative treatments that she could do on her own before she began her radiation treatment at the end of February. And according to the scientists of Forensic Science Center, Gloria must have begun using a well-known controversial home remedy to help with her pain. It was called dimethyl sulfoxide, or DMSO for short. In the 1960s, DMSO was prescribed to treat pain and anxiety, but as it became more popular, it was discovered that it could cause eye damage, and so the government said, you can't use this anymore. But even though DMSO was no longer available as a medicine, it was still being sold in gel form inside of hardware stores as a heavy-duty degreaser. And it was this type of DMSO, the gel form, that Gloria had begun rubbing all over her skin, head to toe. This was the reason when she arrived in the emergency room, her skin looked greasy because she was literally covered head to toe in this gel. It was also why her breath smelled like garlic, because after DMSO is absorbed into your bloodstream, you emit a sort of garlicky smell both through your pores and out of your mouth. But the discovery that Gloria had been using DMSO did not account for why all these people in the hospital began collapsing and falling ill when they were around her. It turned out on the night that Gloria's boyfriend called 911 because Gloria was suffering from breathing problems, Gloria was also suffering from another medical issue, but it was so minor, the boyfriend didn't think to bring it up to the 911 dispatcher or to the paramedics when they arrived. And this secret medical condition that Gloria had was a urinary tract infection, which is an infection in any part of the urinary system. These are very common and usually very easy to treat. But what nobody realized was that because Gloria had this infection, her body was not flushing out the DMSO chemicals that had seeped inside of it from all this gel on her skin. Still, even very large amounts of DMSO chemicals inside of your body or on your skin is not enough to cause any harm to you or people around you. The danger started when the EMTs in the ambulance put that oxygen mask on Gloria's face as they transported her to the hospital. Suddenly, there was this new chemical being introduced into Gloria's body, oxygen. And the scientists from the Forensic Science Center said this new chemical, oxygen, began interacting with the DMSO chemicals trapped inside of Gloria's body, and together they formed a new chemical. Now, if Gloria had gotten to the hospital and responded more positively to the treatments and medicines that the doctors and nurses at the ER gave her, then Julie and the rest of the staff inside of that hospital would never have gotten sick. For that to happen, for that catastrophe to play out inside of that hospital, two very specific things had to happen in the correct order. And they did. First, there was the electric shocks. When the medical team was pumping electrical shocks into Gloria's chest, the scientists from the Forensic Science Center say those charges of electricity interacted with that new chemical that had been created inside of Gloria, and it changed this new chemical again. And this time, the change made the chemical deadly. It became what's known as dimethyl sulfate, which was used as a chemical weapon in World War I. Once Gloria received those shocks to her chest, her body basically became a canister of nerve gas. And then one of the nurses drew Gloria's blood, which was the second event that ultimately set off the catastrophe. Emergency rooms are typically kept fairly cold, roughly 66 degrees Fahrenheit. But when this new deadly chemical was created inside of Gloria, it was still inside of her body where it was warm. And for dimethyl sulfate, when it is warm, it's unstable and much less dangerous. But when that nurse drew Gloria's blood, inside of the blood was the deadly chemical, and now it was no longer in Gloria, it was in this cool 66-degree room, and so it began to stabilize and started producing those little white crystals inside of the blood vial that Julie saw, and as it stabilized, it turned into a gas, and it filled the room, and the staff began to breathe it in. The scientists from the Forensic Science Center do not think that this mass poisoning event contributed to Gloria's death, meaning Gloria did really die from her cancer. Gloria's family has denied that Gloria ever used DMSO, and they still insist that the hospital was responsible for Gloria's death. The hospital would ultimately pay $800,000 in settlement money to Gloria's family, but the hospital would never admit that they did anything wrong. Julie's lawsuit against the hospital was ultimately dismissed, and her bones never really recovered from the damage that was done to them, despite 8 surgeries to try to fix them. However, Julie would eventually go back to being a practicing doctor at another hospital, and she has said the ordeal she went through inside of Trauma Room 1 at Riverside Hospital actually made her a better doctor. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, but many of them are not available on this podcast. They're only on YouTube. Again, the YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast features 3 unique stories about medical mishaps. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Side Effects, and it's about a healthy young man whose life was turned upside down after a minor pain in his leg revealed a big problem. The second story you'll hear is called Traffic, and it's about a seemingly harmless mistake that caused problems 40 years later. And the third and final story you'll hear is called 16 Minutes, and it's about a man who experienced something truly horrific for 16 minutes, and in fact, it actually drove him insane. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please gift the Amazon Music follow button one of those magic 8 balls that can tell the future, but change all the potential answers to, sorry, try again. Okay, let's get into our first story called Side Effects. On the night of October 25th, 2009, a fit, healthy 30-year-old man named Alex was at home in San Diego watching TV in bed. At some point, he noticed there was a slight pain in his left Achilles tendon. A tendon is the fibrous connective tissue that connects muscle to bone, and the Achilles tendon is the biggest tendon in your whole body, and it's the one you can feel on the back of your ankle. It connects your calf muscle to your heel. Alex had never had tendon pain before, and so he assumed it must just be tightness from the long walk he had taken that night around his neighborhood. And so after massaging it for a little while, eventually he kind of forgot about it and just kept watching TV until he fell asleep for the night. The next morning when Alex woke up, he immediately recognized that the pain in his left Achilles tendon was 10 times worse. It was blindingly painful, and then his right Achilles tendon was also now starting to hurt. And so he reflexively reached under the covers and tried to massage his sore tendons. But as soon as he touched the backs of his legs, he felt shooting pain in that area. And so he couldn't touch them anymore. And so instead, he swung his legs off the bed and he sat up on the edge of his bed. And then he slowly rocked forward until he transferred his weight onto his feet and tried to stand up. And as soon as he did, he fell to the ground because of the blinding pain in his tendons. And so he manages to pull himself back up using the bed, and then he hobbles his way out of his bedroom over to the top of the stairs, and then he grabs the railing and he carefully makes his way down the stairs. And as he's walking, it feels like the tendons are so tight, they're gonna snap like a rubber band. And so he gets to the bottom of the stairs and he walks his way around into the kitchen where he sits down and he kind of evaluates what's going on. And he thinks to himself, man, I must be developing a wicked case of tendinitis. Tendinitis is inflammation or irritation of the tendon. And so Alex grabbed his laptop, which was right in front of him. He opened it up and he began looking for ways to alleviate pain from tendinitis. And so after looking in a couple medical forums, he got up and hobbled his way over to the bathroom. He opened up the medicine cabinet and he grabbed the Icy Hot, which is a topical pain reliever. And then he hobbled his way into the first floor living room where he laid down on the couch. And then he applied a healthy amount of Icy Hot on the backs of both of his legs right over his tendons. And then he propped his legs up on 2 pillows. And so he laid there and he's thinking, okay, so it's the weekend. I have today off. I'll just lay here until the pain subsides. But by that evening, the pain had not subsided. It had gotten progressively worse. And so Alex picked up the phone and he called a podiatrist, which is a doctor who specializes in feet and the lower half of your leg. And he made an appointment for the following morning to have a look at his Achilles tendons. And so after he hung up, Alex thought to himself, the best thing I can do is probably just go to bed. I'm bound to feel better in the morning. And so Alex hobbles his way back up the stairs, holding onto the railing, and he goes into his bathroom to wash his face. He reaches for the towel, and he notices his thumb is suddenly locked up, and he can't move his thumb. And then his other thumb, too, locks up, and he's looking at them, and he can't get them to move. And so with his other fingers, he tries to move that thumb and bend that thumb, but he can't do it. The tendon in both of his thumbs had suddenly become unbelievably tight to the point where he couldn't move his thumbs anymore. Up until this point, Alex had convinced himself that whatever was happening with his Achilles tendons was probably minor, that with or without medical intervention, it was bound to just get better. But now he wasn't so sure, because the thumb situation, that really scared him. He had never experienced anything like that, and he couldn't help but think that whatever was happening in his thumbs was probably what was happening in his Achilles, making this a much more complex problem. So Alex forgets about washing his face or even going to bed, and instead leaves the bathroom and grabs the railing and hobbles back downstairs. He makes his way into the kitchen with his stiff thumbs, and he sits down at the table, he opens up his laptop, and he begins looking for any information about what is happening to him. A few minutes into his search, he was about to type something into Google when all of a sudden he felt the rest of his fingers start to lock up. The tendons in his fingers were tightening up just like his thumbs and just like his Achilles tendons. And so now Alex is going into crisis mode. He doesn't know what's happening to him. He has no idea what to do, but he manages to calm himself down, and he told himself, Alex, tomorrow you got a doctor's appointment. They'll know what's wrong with you. They will fix this. Everything's going to be just fine. And so despite his overwhelming urge to panic, he closes his laptop and he hobbles his way over to the stairs. He climbs up to the second floor and he goes directly into his bedroom, crawls in bed, and he goes to sleep. The next morning when he woke up, the tightness and pain in his Achilles tendons and in his hands had not gotten any worse. And that kind of comforted Alex. He's thinking, okay, we're past the worst of this. I just need to figure out what this is and then fix it. And so he crawled out of bed, he hobbled his way over to the stairs, he went down, he grabbed a quick bite to eat, and then he went outside to his car to head out to his doctor's appointment. When he got to his car, he reached for the door handle, and when he pulled on it, he felt an unbelievable surge of pain in the hand that was on the car. And when he looked down, all of the joints in that hand that had been pulling on the car, they had all separated, like the connective tissue that kept his finger whole was no longer strong enough. So Alex screamed and he retracted his hand in horror, and when he looked at it, the joints had gone back to normal, but the pain in this hand persisted. And so on adrenaline alone, Alex managed to use his other hand and got the car door open. He went inside, and then he could barely grip the steering wheel because one hand is now wrecked and his other hand is not much better. But he managed to speed to the doctor's office, and then when he got inside, he could barely fill out the paperwork because one hand was wrecked and the other wasn't much better, so he couldn't grip the pen. But after he gave them his paperwork, the doctor finally came out and they brought him back to an exam room, and that's when Alex explained that originally it was just his Achilles tendons. That's why he had called for this appointment. But after making that appointment, not only had the pain in his Achilles gotten much, much worse, but there was also now pain and tightness in his hands, including one hand that had just fallen apart when he tried to open a door. Alex told the doctor that he had never experienced anything even remotely resembling this in his entire life. He led a very healthy lifestyle and really had no idea what could be causing this. Although he did say 10 days prior, he had finished a round of antibiotics. The drug was called Cipro, but previously he had used this drug with no issues. But as a precaution, he told the doctor because he knew one of the side effects of this drug was tendon problems. And so as a precaution, Alex had actually brought the paperwork for that drug, Cipro, and he gave it to the doctor. And so the doctor, after hearing the story, he reads through the fact sheet of this drug, and he tells Alex that he doesn't think it's a side effect of the drug. He thinks Alex is showing all the signs of having an autoimmune disease, like lupus or multiple sclerosis, and that he needs to go to a rheumatologist and get tested for that. And so Alex is horrified by this. He can't believe that only a couple of days ago, he was totally normal, and now it felt like his whole life was falling apart. And so he left that appointment, he went out to his car, and he called a rheumatologist, and he set up an appointment for a couple of days later to get tested, and then he went home. And over the next couple of days, as he waited for that next appointment, his condition only got worse. Every muscle, joint, and connective tissue in his body was either extremely tight, or hurt, or both. By the time he made it to the rheumatologist's office, he could barely move on his own. After the doctor had run several tests on Alex, Alex began mentally preparing himself to be told that he had an autoimmune disease. He believed at this point that that was the most logical explanation for what was happening to him. But when the test results came back in, to Alex's shock, he was negative across the board. He did not have an autoimmune disease. And so Alex hobbled out of the office, he got out to his car, he sat down, and he was in pain and at a loss. He had no idea what was happening to his body, and it seemed like none of the experts knew either. And so when Alex got back to his house, he made his way into the kitchen and he sat down to do some more research, but he felt like he was at a loss there too. He didn't even know what to research. He had searched for every possible combination of pain, tightness in your Achilles, pain, tightness in your hands and your fingers, and nothing was lining up with his experience. And so he thought to himself, even though that podiatrist ruled out the antibiotic he had taken a cycle of before he started feeling the way he was feeling, even though he ruled that out, I might as well do some more research on it because it's the one thing I can point to that was newly introduced to my life before I had all these things happen to me. And so he opened up his laptop and he typed in Cipro side effects, and what he discovered horrified him. Cipro is part of a class of antibiotics called fluoroquinolones, and while it is a very effective antibiotic, it comes with extremely severe side effects. And enough people who have taken a fluoroquinolone have suffered from these side effects that there's actually a term given to them. They are said to have been floxed. And as Alex discovered in his research, there are many online communities for these floxed individuals, many of which used to be healthy and fit, but after taking these drugs, they became bedridden or had to transition to a wheelchair. This is due to one of the nastiest side effects of this class of drug, ruptured tendons. As a reminder, a tendon connects muscle to bone. And so if you were to say a tendon has ruptured, what you're actually saying is the muscle has torn off of the bone. And apparently, this is unbelievably painful and almost always requires surgery to fix. And in many of these floxing cases, the fluoroquinolone drugs cause these people's tendons to start dramatically tightening until they just start rupturing. And there's nothing they can do to stop it unless they stop moving, hence becoming bedridden and transitioning to wheelchairs. When Alex read all these horrible testimonials of people who had been floxed, he realized their experience mimicked his own. He was floxed. But once he knew what he was up against, he began looking for a timeline. How long would he have these symptoms for? And what he saw was most people experience these awful symptoms for about 3 months and then they fade away. So for 3 months, Alex suffered, but he stayed positive. He was certain he was going to get better. But 3 months came and went, and he didn't get better. In fact, he got worse. All of his tendons continued to tighten, and some of them ruptured, and he had to quit his job and had to move in with his parents. But he stayed positive. He went back online, and he began reading about more severe floxing cases, and he saw those people typically saw a big turnaround at the 3-year mark. And while that was overwhelming and awful and disheartening, he at least had something to look at as the light at the end of the tunnel. And so for 3 more years, he waited and waited in pain. He eventually became completely bedridden and completely dependent on his parents. But then the 3-year mark came and went, and much like the 3-month mark, nothing got better, he just got worse. And that was when Alex realized he was in the range of people that suffered from their floxing permanently. In 2016, so 7 years after taking that fateful dose of Cipro, he wrote a blog post on his website updating the world about his condition. In it, he says he's only gotten worse and that his life effectively came to an end in 2009 when over a 6-day period he swallowed those 12 Cipro pills. And so now all he looks forward to is his death. Our next story is called Traffic. In 2013, 46-year-old Paul Baxter started feeling sick, and then he developed a wicked cough that got so bad over a couple of days that he could barely speak because he was just coughing the entire time. And so he went to his doctor, who quickly diagnosed him with pneumonia and put him on a treatment plan. But after several months of being on this plan and not having his condition improve at all, his doctor referred him to a respiratory clinic. There, they did an x-ray of his chest and they discovered a suspicious shadow in the lower right section of his lung. Doctors were concerned, especially given the fact that Paul was a long-term smoker, but before they just put him under the knife and started cutting this out of his lung, they decided they would take a probe with a camera on the end of it and run it down into his lungs and actually have a look around inside. During the procedure, which Paul was awake for, the doctor put the probe down into that shadow area in his lung, and right away he saw this lump. But when he zoomed in with his camera on the lump itself, he saw there was something orange sticking out of it. And so he told Paul there were little pincers at the end of this probe, and he was going to try to move the tissue around to try to see what this thing was, and if it was a foreign object, he would try to pull it out. But when he tried to move around the tissue to get a better look, he couldn't get it dislodged, and so he pulled the probe out, and he told Paul he would need to come back in a couple of days when he could use a longer and more powerful probe. And so Paul looks at the doctor and he's like, well, what is it? What is this orange thing inside of my lungs? And the doctor said, honestly, I have no idea, but it's not supposed to be in there. A few days later, Paul went back in for this follow-up procedure, and the doctor, using this longer, more powerful probe, was able to go down and actually dislodge this orange thing from inside of his lungs. And as soon as he pulled it free, there was a camera screen that was watching in real time what this probe was seeing. And so Paul and the doctor and the other doctors that were in there as well all got to see for the first time what this thing was. And it was this kind of triangular small orange thing that nobody had seen before. And so as it was getting pulled up and out of Paul's body, everyone's just watching the camera, wondering what this thing is. And then finally, the pinchers came out of Paul's mouth, revealing what it was holding on to, and nobody could believe what they were looking at. What it was holding on to was a small plastic orange traffic cone from a child's play toy set. And as soon as Paul saw it, a memory came rushing back to him, and he told the doctors when he was 7 years old, he swallowed, or so he thought, a cone that looked an awful lot like this one, except he hadn't swallowed it, he had inhaled it. And then somehow, for 40 plus years, he'd had no symptoms related to it until now when he developed that cough. Paul would say when he had this revelation in front of the doctors, there was a moment of silence, and then everybody just started cracking up laughing because none of the doctors had seen anything like it before and didn't really know how to react to it. And so Paul was allowed to keep his traffic cone, and after he left, his cough went away and he went back to normal. The next and final story of today's episode is called 16 Minutes. In 2006, 73-year-old Sherman Sizemore was the definition of a man's man. He had spent the bulk of his adult life doing one of the most dangerous jobs in the world, mining for coal in West Virginia. And while he was a coal miner, he apparently had lost track of the amount of times he had nearly been killed from mine shaft collapse and gas leaks. Later on in life, after his kids had all grown up, he had retired from coal mining and become an ordained Baptist minister. And despite his harrowing backstory and burly, intimidating appearance, he was known to be incredibly gentle and very calming to his parishioners. He was also known to be an incredibly devoted grandfather, to the point where if there was a chance to spend time with his grandkids, he would basically throw all of his responsibilities out the window to do that. But in January of that year, something changed in Sherman. He went from being this pillar in the community to being a deranged, paranoid lunatic. It all started on the afternoon of January 19th. Sherman and his wife Ruby were sitting in their home alone on the couch, just kind of doing their own things, when suddenly, out of the blue, Sherman just starts screaming as if he sees something in front of him that's terrifying him, and his screams startled Ruby so that she started screaming, and so she looks at her husband, and he's still just looking straight out ahead. He's terrified of something in front of him, and so Ruby looks from him to where he's looking, and there's nothing there. And so she turns back to her husband, and she's like, "What's going on? What are you screaming for? What are you so scared of?" But Sherman wasn't able to speak. After he stopped screaming, he just continued to look straight out as if whatever had terrified him had him in this trance where he couldn't look away. And so his eyes are wide, his mouth is open, his face is going white, he's starting to sweat, and Ruby's starting to panic. She has no idea what's happening with him. And so eventually she just holds on to him and says, "Come back to me, come back to me." And Sherman at some point he kind of broke out of his trance, and he looked at his wife and he just says, "You can't leave me or they'll kill me." Ruby has never seen behavior like this in her husband ever. This is a completely different person she's interacting with, and so she has no idea what to do. And so instead, she just kind of holds on to Sherman and prays that he doesn't start acting like that again. But that didn't happen. All day long, periodically, he would just start screaming about something that Ruby couldn't see. Now, Ruby did consider calling 911 and getting medics out there, but his behavior was so unusual, and he was normally such a rock who was so competent, who was so healthy that she didn't want to. She felt like he would just kind of get through this, that if they can just get through today and get into tomorrow, that he would be better. And so she just all day was comforting him and just dealing with these episodes. And then finally they got into bed that night, and Ruby's thinking, thank goodness, we're going to wake up tomorrow and things will be better. But when she woke up the next morning, it was very obvious Sherman had not slept at all. He was looking straight up at the ceiling. He looked worse than the day before. It was obvious that he was not back to normal. And so Ruby called the rest of the family and had them come over to figure out what they were going to do. But when Sherman found out his family was coming to his house, he told Ruby they can't come inside. He was afraid they and others were conspiring to bury him alive. The only person he could be around was Ruby, and his whole family had no idea what to do. Little did they know there was actually a very specific reason he was acting the way he was. A few months before January 19th, which was the day Sherman turned into this different person, a few months earlier, he began complaining of severe abdominal pains. And so he and his wife Ruby and his daughter, they went to the hospital, and the doctor, after examining him and running some tests, determined that most likely his pain was coming from his gallbladder. But the only way to be sure would be to do some exploratory surgery and literally look inside of Sherman's gut and look at his gallbladder and see if that was the problem. And so the doctor asked Sherman, are you prepared to do an exploratory surgery, or would you like to just kind of wait it out and see what happens with this pain? And so Sherman talked it over with his wife and his family, and they made the decision that the pain was just too much, and so they would go forward with the surgery. And so on the morning of January 19th, so again, this is the day that Sherman basically loses his mind, he goes into the hospital completely normal. He goes in with his wife, he goes in with his daughter, and he makes his way over to the surgery wing of the hospital. He says bye to his family, and he's put on a stretcher bed, and he's wheeled in and prepped for surgery, and then brought into the operating room. And while he was in the operating room, laying on his stretcher bed, flat on his back, looking straight up at all these bright lights above him, he just struck up some chit-chat with the nurses and doctors who were in the room, prepping the room for surgery, and they were also putting the IV into his arm. Then at some point, one of the nurses lowered the oxygen mask onto Sherman's face so the anesthesiologist could administer the 2-drug cocktail that would knock him out for the surgery. Sherman was scheduled to get something known as general anesthesia for this operation, where basically he would be completely out, he wouldn't feel anything, they'd do the surgery, and then he would wake up in recovery. And so once this mask was on Sherman's face, the anesthesiologist began pumping him full of the drugs that would make him be knocked out for the surgery. However, the anesthesiologist only administered one of the 2 drugs necessary for general anesthesia. He administered the paralyzing drug, but he did not administer the actual anesthetic that would knock him out, and most importantly, would get rid of all of his pain. And so as this mask is on his face and Sherman believes he's being given the proper dosage of drugs, the nurse who was nearby told Sherman to go ahead and start counting backwards in his head from 10, knowing full well that Sherman would pass out before he reached 0. And Sherman knew this too. He had been in surgery before, and so he happily began counting in his head. 10, 9, 8, he started to feel something. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Boom, he was out. Except he wasn't. When he reached 0 in his head, counting down, he realized he had not passed out. He began taking mental stock of what was going on, and he realized he could completely feel his body, but when he tried to move his body, he couldn't. He was completely paralyzed. When he tried to make a sound, he couldn't because his vocal cords were also paralyzed. The only thing he could move were his eyes. He could move them left and right. However, they had taped his eyes shut, so he can't see anything. And so Sherman is thinking to himself, okay, I've been given the drugs, maybe they're slow acting, any minute now I'm going to drift off to sleep and this will just be a distant memory. But after a few seconds, he's hearing the doctors and nurses in the room. He can't see them, but he hears them. They seem to be moving towards doing this operation, and he's still awake. And so Sherman becomes frantic and starts flicking his eyes left and right as fast as he possibly can. And the rapid eye movement actually loosened the tape on both of his eyelids, and it created a tiny slit that he could actually look through. And what he saw terrified him. The surgeon was walking over next to him. He was getting his gloves on. And then the surgeon says, "Scalpel." And the nurse hands him this chrome metallic blade. And the surgeon takes the blade and begins cutting into Sherman's midsection. Sherman felt everything, but Sherman couldn't do anything about it. All he could do was rapidly flick his eyes left and right in hopes one of them would see that he was awake, that he was feeling this. But no one was paying attention to his face, so they didn't see his eyes moving around. And so the surgeon continued to cut into his midsection until he had cut out a fairly significantly sized hole, at which point the surgeon hands the scalpel to the nurse and says, "Clamps." At which point the nurse hands him what looks like a torture device, and the surgeon proceeds to use these clamps to pin segments of Sherman's skin that has just been cut open to his body to basically keep the hole open. And then the surgeon began tugging on the outsides of this hole in Sherman's midsection, making sure it was big enough that he could actually get a good look into his body. And every little tug is sending lightning bolts of pain into Sherman's body. But again, all he can do is flick his eyes left and right, and no one's paying attention. Scope, the surgeon called out for, and the nurse handed him a camera that he jammed into Sherman's gut. And then the surgeon said, "Suction," and the nurse got what looked like a vacuum and pressed it inside of this open wound and began sucking out fluids from his body. The pain Sherman was experiencing is unimaginable. Every second felt like an eternity. Forceps, the surgeon called, and the nurse handed him these metal prongs that he put inside of this hole in Sherman's body, and he used them to dislodge his gallbladder so he could get a better look at it. By this point, Sherman wanted to die. He was no longer flicking his eyes left and right. He was just looking straight out, hoping someone would finally see him. And someone did. One of the nurses standing next to the surgeon looked up at Sherman's face and saw Sherman looking back, terrified at the nurse, at which point the nurse yelled out, "Stop, he's awake, he's awake!" And the surgeon practically faints, and he looks over at the anesthesiologist and he calls him, "Get over here and fix this." And so the anesthesiologist comes running over from the side of the room. He gets up next to Sherman and begins pumping him full of painkillers. And as he's doing this, he has this moment of clarity. He remembers he didn't give him the anesthetic. And so as these new painkillers that have just been introduced begin to take their effect, Sherman's eyes go from being terrified to glazed over, and he does pass off to sleep. And so now he's out and he can't feel anything. But now the anesthesiologist and the medical team realize they have a very big problem. This patient just experienced 16 minutes of surgery and felt all of it. And at the end of it, when he wakes up, he's going to remember it, and he's probably going to file a lawsuit against the hospital. And so a decision was made. It's unclear if the anesthesiologist acted alone or if the entire team was in on this, but regardless, the anesthesiologist administered an additional drug after giving all these painkillers. This additional drug was called midazolam, but it's better known as the amnesia drug. And like its nickname implies, anyone who gets it will forget what has just happened to them. And so the idea was by giving him this amnesia drug, he won't remember the trauma he had suffered through during the surgery, and so wouldn't file a lawsuit. And so after he was given this drug, the medical team, they went back to doing the surgery, they completed it, they got him back out to recovery, and then when Sherman woke up in recovery, he did not remember what had happened to him inside of the operating room, at least not consciously. Those horrible 16 minutes had been implanted on Sherman's subconscious. Basically, his body recognized that he had experienced extreme trauma. However, the amnesia drug wiped away the memory of how he received that trauma. So there's this big disconnect in his memory. And so when Sherman came to in the recovery room, he immediately sensed something was horribly, horribly wrong. He was scared, he was anxious, he had this incredible sense of dread, but he had no memory to tie these feelings to. And so as Sherman is sitting in recovery, he must have tried to kind of hide the way he was feeling because he didn't even remotely understand it. He had been completely happy and normal going into the surgery, and now a couple of hours later, he's a complete mess. And so he leaves the hospital that day on January 19th. He goes back to his house and he sits on the couch with his wife. And as he's sitting there, suddenly these horrible feelings he's having, they become too much. And he basically has a panic attack and he starts screaming out and he's terrified of something, but he doesn't know what it is. And then over the next couple of days, he began having these flashbacks where he would access the actual 16 minutes of torture he went through. But when he would see someone cutting into him and opening his chest up and sucking things out of it, he didn't think that happened to me and that's why I feel this way. Instead, he thought it was just this horrible nightmare that he couldn't escape from. And so his family did eventually start getting doctors and psychologists and all these people involved to figure out what was wrong with him. But before they could figure it out, the whole situation had just become too terrible for Sherman. And so on February 2nd, just 2 weeks after he came out of that surgery, he would take his own life. His family was unbelievably heartbroken. It didn't seem real that this had happened. And so they would continue to dig and figure out what went wrong. And they would finally get their hands on the medical report from the gallbladder exploratory surgery on January 19th. And after giving it to another doctor to look over, this doctor discovered that Sherman had in fact experienced 16 minutes of something known as anesthesia awareness, where you are awake or feel a portion of your surgery. And shockingly, this happens to 20,000 people a year. However, Sherman's case, forgetting the amnesia drug, just literally what he went through, 16 full minutes of this really intensive surgery that he felt, that is an absolute rarity. That does not happen very often. Sherman's family would go on to sue the hospital, and they would be awarded an undisclosed amount of money from the hospital in 2008. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please gift the Amazon Music follow button one of those magic 8 balls that can tell the future, but change all the potential answers to, sorry, try again. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. We have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation that honors and supports victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballen.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 3 medical horror stories. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called All in Her Head, and it's about an infant who is rushed to the emergency room, but what doctors discover will leave you stunned. The second story you'll hear is called A Mouthful, and it's about a woman whose life would forever change after a routine walk down the street. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Only You Can Save Her, and it's about a puzzled surgeon who tries one last crazy effort to save his patient's life. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the Amazon Music follow button to your wedding, but give them the wrong date, time, and location. Okay, let's get into our first story called All in Her Head. One morning in the spring of 1982, a mother rushed to the reception desk at the Royal London Hospital in England, cradling her 6-week-old baby girl named Claire. Claire was her first and only child, and like a lot of first-time parents, the mother was very paranoid about her daughter's health. And so anytime there was a change in her behavior or her appearance changed, it was like this mom rushed to the doctor. And that morning, the mother had noticed something very unusual on her daughter's head. There were 2 raised white lines that made the shape of a plus sign. There was one line that ran from the nape of her neck all the way in back, all the way up her head to her forehead, and the other line was horizontal, and it went from behind one ear all the way to the other ear. Now, this mother had no idea what these lines were, what they meant, what caused them, and so as soon as she saw them, she scooped her kid up and she headed to the hospital. Now, in the past, every time this mother had brought Claire to the hospital, the visit always ended with, "Your child is just fine." But this time, when the receptionist saw Claire's head and saw those lines, she immediately said, "Those do not look normal." And so she handed the mother some paperwork and told her they would get Claire to a neurologist as soon as they could. "15 minutes later, the mother stood in an exam room and watched as the hospital's pediatric neurologist, Dr. Farhad Afshar, examined Claire's head. And after a moment, Dr. Afshar stepped back and he explained to the mother that these raised lines on her daughter's head were something known as bulging fontanelles. So when a baby is born, the bones of their skull are not actually fused together yet. And the thin gaps between these separate skull bones are called fontanelles. And Dr. Afshar told Claire's mom that when a baby's fontanelles begin to bulge like this, it's usually because the child's brain is so swollen that it's beginning to push the skull bones apart. Dr. Afshar told Claire's mom that she had made the right decision to bring her daughter to the hospital. But he was clear that a lot of things can cause a baby's brain to swell and potentially cause these bulging fontanelles, and so in order to figure out what was going on, they would need to order a CAT scan. Claire's mom felt uneasy, but she said okay, and so they did the CT scan, and then a few minutes later, Dr. Afshar came back into the room with the results. And with a grave expression on his face, he told Claire's mother that he had some terrible news. Her daughter had a brain tumor. Hearing this, Claire's mom felt like the entire world was crumbling all around her. She was terrified for her daughter, and she had a million questions. But before she could ask any of them, Dr. Afshar said, "There's something else." He said that normally brain tumors are made up of brain cells. But based on the CT scan, it looked like Claire's tumor inside of her brain was made partially of fat and partially of bone. Dr. Afshar said he had never seen anything like this and couldn't even begin to explain it. But the one thing he did know is that whatever this thing was, it had to come out of Claire. Leaving it inside of her head could at a minimum cause serious neurological damage, or at worst could even kill the child. So Dr. Afshar told Claire's mom that she only had really one option. Claire needed brain surgery. Even though the operation was very risky for a child as young as Claire was, it was the only way they could figure out what this mass actually was, and it was the only way to get it out. Soon after their conversation, Dr. Afshar was standing in the operating room with Claire, sedated, laying face down on the table in front of him. Dr. Afshar made an incision across the back of Claire's head. Then he cut a rectangle into her skull, essentially creating a small door. He opened up that door to see the bottom of Claire's brain. He delicately moved the left and right hemispheres of Claire's brain slightly apart so he could reach the section where the tumor was. And that's when he got his first glimpse of this strange mass. He grabbed it with a pair of surgical tongs and gently tugged, and he was surprised at how easily it began to slide out. And slowly it came into the light. And when Dr. Afshar finally got a full look at what this thing was, he was so stunned he just froze, staring at this thing that seemed impossible. And so after setting this strange mass aside, Dr. Afshar closed her skull, stitched her head up, and then sent her to the pediatric ICU. Claire laid unconscious in a hospital bed with her mother by her side for weeks. Meanwhile, Dr. Afshar ordered a genetic test on the mass he had removed from Claire's brain. And it turned out Claire was not an only child like her mother thought. She was actually a twin. And the mass that Dr. Afshar had removed from Claire's brain was her twin sibling's fetus. Claire had an extremely rare condition called fetus in fetu. Fetus in fetu occurs in the very early stages of a twin pregnancy, when cells don't divide properly and one fetus becomes enveloped by the other. The enveloping twin looks like a single baby, but they're actually born with their siblings' partially developed fetus still inside of their body. The fetus in Claire's head was 5.5 inches long. It had 2 arms, 2 legs, but its head hadn't formed yet. And Claire's case was extra rare because her twin's fetus was found inside of her skull. In all of global medical history, intracranial fetus in fetu had only ever been recorded 18 other times. And it was thought to be a fatal diagnosis because to this point, all the others who had it had died. But after 2 weeks in the ICU, Claire woke up. And a week after that, she was healthy enough to go back home. And by 18 months old, she had fully recovered and had no lingering neurological problems. As far as the medical literature suggests, Claire was the first person to ever survive having her own twin removed from her brain. Our next story is called A Mouthful. Around 1 p.m. on August 6, 2011, a 32-year-old seafood vendor named Carla Flores stood in the entryway of her home, balancing a tray of shrimp in one hand and waving goodbye to her 3 kids with the other. She told her kids she'd be right back, and then she stepped out the front door onto the streets of Culiacan, which is a major city in northwestern Mexico. Carla was going to deliver this tray of shrimp to one of her regular customers. She walked down an alleyway and then onto a main road and then eventually into a neighborhood with a whole bunch of brightly colored houses. She went up to one of them and knocked on the door. A man answered, and Carla handed him the tray of shrimp. He took the shrimp, gave her a handful of cash. She thanked him and turned and headed back down towards the street. And Carla had made it all the way back to the alleyway right near her house when suddenly she heard this loud sound, and then before she could figure out what it was, this small, hard object smashed into her right cheek, and it hit her so hard she fell onto the pavement. And so instinctively, Carla reached up and she touched her cheek, and she felt a warm, wet liquid. She looked at her hand, and it was covered in blood. Carla tried to get up, but her ears were ringing and she felt dizzy, and then suddenly, everything went black. "20 minutes later, a receptionist at Culiacan General Hospital watched as a man carried a bloody, unconscious woman into the emergency room. He laid her down on a bench in the waiting area, and then he just turned around and began walking back out again. The receptionist jumped up and chased after this guy, demanding to know what was going on with this woman. Who is she? What happened to her? What are you doing? But the guy just said, look, I was driving down the road and I saw this woman bloody in the streets, and so I brought her here. I promise you, that's all I know. And then he turned and kept on walking, and the receptionist went back inside to check on the woman. The receptionist looked down at the woman. She was unconscious, her mouth was hanging open, and the entire right side of her face was totally mangled. And then embedded in this mess on the right side of her cheek, basically in her head, was this weird dark-colored object, but she couldn't tell what it was, and she didn't have time to stand around trying to find out. So she called for help, and a couple of nurses came running out of the emergency room, and together they lifted this woman up, put her on a gurney, and wheeled her back to see a doctor. A few moments later, Dr. Gustavo Mesa walked into Carla's hospital room. He'd been briefed on her condition, but when he went inside, she was no longer unconscious. Now her eyes were wide open, and she looked totally confused. Dr. Mesa could tell Carla was having trouble breathing, and she couldn't close her mouth. But then Carla began making this grunting sound, and at first the doctor couldn't understand what she was saying, but then it became clear she was saying, rock, rock, rock. Dr. Mesa's first thought was, oh, she's telling me she was hit by a rock. That's what's caused her injury. And so Dr. Mesa leaned in and looked at her wound, and he caught a glimpse of what looked like a dark-colored stone buried inside of her cheek. Dr. Mesa thought, wow, she must have been hit so hard by this rock, this stone, for it to get buried that far inside of her face. He promised Carla he would get it out, but first he told her she would have to undergo an x-ray to really figure out where it was in her skull and how exactly they'd be able to get it out. A few minutes later, Dr. Mesa stood in the radiology department looking over Carla's x-ray images. And it was immediately clear to him and all the other medical staff that what was in Carla's cheek was not a rock. Because the object was shaped like an oval, it had round edges, and it was perfectly symmetrical. To Dr. Mesa, it just seemed far too uniform to be a rock. But he didn't have a better guess for what it was. All he could tell from the x-ray was this object had broken Carla's upper and lower jaw and shattered several of her teeth. And now this object was stuck between her broken jawbones. Dr. Mesa knew it was going to take surgery to get this thing out, but he needed more information before he felt confident operating. So he ordered a CAT scan of Carla's head to give him a more detailed picture of this object. And when the results came in and Dr. Mesa looked at the image, his face went pale. He couldn't believe what he was looking at, but the proof was right there in front of him. And he knew he would have to do something, and fast. So Dr. Mesa ran to the nearest nurse's station and told the nurse to evacuate everybody from the emergency room. Then he grabbed the hospital phone and he dialed a military official. Less than an hour later, Carla was no longer in the hospital. She was now out in the middle of a grassy field, laying on her back, absolutely terrified. An anesthesiologist walked up to her and injected a local anesthetic into her cheek. And suddenly, the agonizing pain that Carla had felt ever since waking up in the hospital was now gone. But her absolute terror was not. Carla knew there were 2 doctors and a nurse standing by to perform an operation on her, but also there were 2 army soldiers just a few feet away from her, staring at her. Carla saw a doctor start to bring a scalpel toward her face, and she had to close her eyes to keep from flinching. She heard the soldiers giving directions and the clinking of surgical instruments. And all the while, Carla kept her eyes shut tight and just tried to pretend none of this was even happening. And after what felt like a lifetime, Carla felt a shift inside of her face, and it was the doctors and nurses pulling this object out of her cheek. Carla opened her eyes, and right above her head, she saw the doctor holding the bloody thing they had just removed from her face. It was a live grenade. That's why she was being operated on, not in the hospital, but out in this open field, because if it did go off mid-operation, it would at least limit casualties. And that's also why the military was called in to tell the medical staff how to handle this live piece of ordnance in the middle of the operation. After the grenade was safely removed from Carla's face, it was disposed of by the army soldiers. It's believed that the grenade that hit Carla was fired out of a grenade launcher. That would explain the loud sound she heard in the alleyway before it hit her in the face. Luckily though, the grenade's fuse that should have ignited and caused it to explode didn't work. So even though it absolutely was a live grenade, it didn't explode, and so it didn't kill her. It's unknown who shot the grenade, why they shot it, or whether Carla was the intended target or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Carla would ultimately lose half her teeth, she would undergo multiple reconstructive surgeries, and she would be left with a huge scar on her right cheek. But she said she was just happy to be alive. And she was forever grateful to the stranger who brought her to the hospital, and to the medical team and the army soldiers who risked their lives to save her. The next and final story of today's episode is called Only You Can Save Her. One morning in January of 2016, a 45-year-old woman named Lauren walked into an office building in West Virginia where she worked as an office manager, and she dropped her purse, her phone, and her cigarettes on her desk. It was a Friday, and so Lauren was in a really good mood because she was pumped about the weekend. The next day, Saturday, she and her husband Dan planned to go on this big hike together. They loved hiking, so that was going to be awesome. And then on Sunday, Lauren planned to stay home all day and cook one big meal because it had become a tradition in their family that on Sundays, Lauren and Dan's kids, they had 3 kids who were all grown up, they would come back home to their parents' house and they would have a big family meal together. And these dinners were definitely the highlight of the week for Lauren and for Dan because both of them were very family-centric. Lauren switched on her computer and then looked at her schedule and saw she had a whole bunch of meetings back to back to back that day, and so immediately she was worried that she would not be able to slip out that day and go for a quick walk. Something she had recently been doing a lot of because her doctor had recently told her that she had a blood circulation disorder that was called peripheral vascular disease. And what that meant was the arteries that carried the blood from her heart down to her legs and her feet were becoming blocked, and so her legs and feet were not getting enough oxygen. So far, her only symptoms were the occasional leg cramp, but if the disease got worse, it could lead to pain and mobility issues, and also heart attack and stroke. Luckily, Lauren's doctor told her that she didn't need medication, she just needed to quit smoking, change her diet, and become more physically active. And Lauren had totally leaned into this and was being much more active and had changed her diet. She hadn't quit smoking yet, but she planned to. And so Lauren really felt like she was on the right track. And so as Lauren kind of began her day, going through her emails and thinking about when she's going to do this walk, her cell phone rang. When Lauren looked at the phone, she didn't recognize the number, so she decided to let it go to voicemail. And so Lauren forgot about her phone and just figured whoever this was, they'd call back or whatever, and she's doing her thing. But then she got another phone call. And when she looked, it was the same number calling her back. And this time, Lauren did pick up the phone. And when she said hello, on the other end of the line, she heard a police officer say in a very serious voice, "Am I speaking to Dan's wife?" And so right away, Lauren's heart began to race, and she would tell the officer, yes, what's going on? And all the officer would tell her is that Dan, unfortunately, was in a very serious car accident, and so you need to come to the scene right away. In an absolute panic, Lauren hung up the phone, she grabbed her things, she ran out to the car, and she floored her way to the address the police officer gave her. But when she got there, she saw there were so many police cars and ambulances and all these people that she couldn't even see what was going on, let alone park anywhere near where this accident happened. So she wound up parking her car around the corner, and then she got out and just sprinted towards all the police. And then when she got up to them, she basically began pushing people out of the way, and no one tried to stop her. They could tell, this woman must know the people involved in this crash. And so she pushed past all these people, and finally she can see through the crowd, and she can see her husband's car, and it's absolutely mangled. And there's all these first responders that are in a circle on the pavement, and she can tell there is somebody on the ground they're working on, and it's gotta be Dan. And so Lauren just began running towards that group of people, and as she did, they all stood up as if, there was nothing they could do. And on the ground, Lauren saw her husband. There was Dan lying in this huge pool of blood, just motionless on the ground. And so before she even got over to her husband, Lauren already knew what had happened. Dan was dead. And so Lauren let out this primal shriek and just rushed over to her husband and fell to the ground next to him, holding his body and crying hysterically. And all the EMTs and first responders, they knew this woman has just lost her husband. And even though she shouldn't be here right now, they just felt like they have to give this moment to her. And so the police and the EMTs and the rest of the first responders, instead of even talking to Lauren or trying to get her to go somewhere else, they just formed a big circle, shoulder to shoulder, around Lauren and Dan, and just allowed Lauren to grieve in private. About 2 hours later, Lauren returned to her home in a daze. Dan's body had already been transported to the morgue, and a police officer had driven Lauren back to her home where her 3 kids, her son and her 2 daughters, were now waiting for her. And so when Lauren went inside the house and went into the living room where her kids were, her kids, who already knew what had happened, they just immediately swarmed her and hugged her, and they all just cried together. I mean, this was so horrible and so unexpected that nobody knew what to do. Finally, Lauren tried to speak through her sobs, but when she did, she just couldn't get words out. It was like her chest was so tight she couldn't even speak. And then suddenly, Lauren realized this pressure on her chest was very real, and it was getting worse and worse, to the point where it was genuinely hard to take a breath in. And so Lauren actually said to her kids, "I think I'm having a panic attack." And so her daughter ran to the kitchen to get some water, and as she did, Lauren took a seat on the couch to try to calm down. But by the time her daughter came back with the glass of water, Lauren straight up just could not breathe. I mean, she was trying to pull air in, but it wasn't going in, and she was totally panicking. And so she looked at her kids and just mouthed the words, "I can't breathe." At which point the kids understood, like, this is way beyond just grief and sadness. Like, she's having a physical emergency right now. And so one of Lauren's daughters picked up the phone and called 911. A few minutes later, an ambulance arrived and they would take Lauren to a local hospital. But as soon as they got there, the doctors and nurses determined that very likely Lauren had had a heart attack. And even though she was basically stable right now, their fear is she was going to have another one. And this particular local hospital just lacked the resources and staff to actually treat Lauren. And so they pretty much immediately transferred Lauren to another hospital called the JW Memorial Hospital in Morgantown, West Virginia, because that hospital had a specialized cardiac care unit for people with very serious heart problems. Dr. Conard Falinger was the cardiologist on duty at JW Memorial Hospital when Lauren was brought into the intensive care unit, followed closely behind by her 3 adult children. Now, Dr. Falinger was used to seeing worried families in the hospital, but Lauren's kids looked far more distressed than he was used to seeing. And when he spoke to Lauren's kids about, what's going on with Lauren, he would see why. The doctor would learn that this family has lost their father, their husband, just a few hours earlier. And the mother, Lauren, who's this patient, she laid with her dead husband out on the road in a pool of blood. And now these poor kids who just lost their father, they're seeing their mother go to the ICU for what looks like a heart attack. I mean, this was a total worst case scenario where basically everything was going wrong for this family. Dr. Falinger did his best to push his emotions to the side. He didn't want to get wrapped up emotionally in this case, but at the same time, the doctor felt a very deep need to save Lauren. Like, let this family have one good thing happen to them. But Lauren's condition was pretty dire. Just like the doctors at that local hospital where Lauren went first, Dr. Falinger also suspected Lauren had a heart attack, very likely because of that blood circulation disorder that she had that basically clogged her arteries. When an artery in the heart gets blocked, the blood can't circulate in the heart, and so the heart dies. And preliminary testing on Lauren showed there was already signs of damage to her heart, in the same way that a heart attack would damage a heart. Her heartbeat was also irregular and it was too fast, and her blood pressure was dangerously low. And then also, when Dr. Falinger looked at some imaging of Lauren's heart, he could see that the majority of her heart muscle wasn't even moving. Basically, Lauren's heart was working way harder and way faster than it should be to accomplish nothing. And so, very quickly, Dr. Falinger realized that unless he was able to find the blocked artery in Lauren's heart and clear it, that Lauren would die. And so Dr. Falinger looked up at Lauren's 3 kids who were just standing there in silence, waiting for more bad news. And Dr. Falinger said to them, "Your mom needs to go into surgery right now." Nurses wheeled Lauren out of the ICU and into surgery, where she was immediately put under anesthesia. Once Lauren was ready, Dr. Falinger watched on a monitor as another surgeon fed a thin, flexible tube, called a catheter, into an artery in Lauren's leg and then fed it up towards her heart. This surgery was called cardiac angioplasty. Basically, that surgeon was going to use that catheter, that tube, and put it into Lauren's heart and then shoot dye through that catheter tube into the blood in Lauren's heart. And then Dr. Falinger and the other doctors could watch to see where this dye went. If the dye was pumped out of the heart like it should be, they'd see it go in all different directions. But if at some point on the monitor the dye just stopped inside the heart and didn't go anywhere, then that would mean they found a blockage. And so when the surgeon had the catheter in Lauren's heart, he injected the dye and they all watched on the monitor, and her heart functioned completely fine. There was no blockage in her heart. Now, the doctors weren't entirely convinced yet that there was no blockage, so they pulled that catheter out and they got a different one and they went through the exact procedure all over again to see if maybe that catheter was malfunctioning. But again, that second time, the dye didn't stop anywhere. Her heart seemed to be functioning totally normally. And so Dr. Falinger and the rest of the doctors and surgeons, they were all totally baffled, because what this meant was whatever was happening to Lauren, or whatever did happen to Lauren, was not a heart attack. But make no mistake, Lauren's heart was still absolutely dying. It was just some other thing killing it. Dr. Falinger went back to the drawing board, but realistically, there just weren't that many other things to consider with regards to what was happening to Lauren. Heavy alcohol use could in theory cause what was happening to Lauren, but Lauren didn't drink. Infection was another option, but Lauren showed no signs of having an infection. Certain chemotherapy drugs have been known to damage the heart, but Lauren wasn't on chemo and certainly would not have accidentally been exposed to chemo drugs without knowing about it. And so basically, Dr. Falinger had no clue what was wrong with Lauren, and he didn't even know where to start. And so Dr. Falinger just sat in his office feeling so bad about the fact that, these kids are almost certainly gonna lose their other parent. I mean, it was his duty to save Lauren and he couldn't do it. And he just felt so bad. He couldn't even imagine how he was gonna deliver the news to the kids that, your mom's gonna die and we don't know why. I mean, this was the worst for Dr. Falinger. He felt like he had failed as a doctor. But just then, Dr. Falinger has this epiphany. He remembers this weird medical article he had read somewhat recently, and he realized what was going on with Lauren and her family was like the same thing that happened in that article. And because Dr. Falinger did not have any other ideas of how to handle what was going on with Lauren, he decided he would just try to do what they did in that article, because if he was wrong, he had nothing to lose. So Dr. Falinger got up and he ran to Lauren's hospital room, and when he got in there, he saw Lauren's kids and he called them over to him. And he would tell them that he's going to give their mom some medication that's going to spike her blood pressure and keep it high. But then he needs them to gather around her and just talk to her like she's your mom. Talk lovingly, soothingly, remind her that you're still here and that everything is okay. And the kids, they all agreed to do this. And then Dr. Fallinger, he gave the medicine to Lauren, and then he watched as her 3 kids circled up around the head of the bed, and they're all crying and holding their mom and telling her how much they love her and please come back to us, come back. And as they're doing this, Dr. Fallinger just quietly walked out of the room, hoping this would work. And sure enough, just a week later, Lauren was all better. It would turn out the way in which Lauren lost her husband, both the suddenness of getting that phone call, combined with just the unthinkable horror of seeing your loved one on the road in a pool of blood dead. I mean, that situation was so stressful for Lauren that her brain released a ton of stress hormones into her body. So much so that these stress hormones literally paralyzed her heart. And so you can understand why all the doctors thought this was a heart attack, because this sort of looked like one. But this condition does have its own name. It's called stress cardiomyopathy. However, it's known by its more casual name, which is broken heart syndrome. Basically, Lauren loved her husband so much that to witness what happened to him and to learn about it so suddenly and abruptly, it nearly killed her. And it just so happens that a few months before Lauren was checked into the hospital, Dr. Fallinger happened to read a medical article about broken heart syndrome. And the only way you can treat broken heart syndrome is just to try to keep the patient alive long enough that the stress hormones leave their body naturally, at which point their heart goes back to normal. And so Dr. Fallinger was able to buy Lauren a little bit of time right at the end there by giving her that medicine that boosted her blood pressure. But Dr. Fallinger told her 3 kids that really it was up to them to keep their mother alive. They needed to crowd around their mom and just talk to her and tell her that you love her, show her that you're here with her, give her a reason to fight and hold on. Even though she's not saying or doing anything, she's still alive and she can hear you. So talk to her. And so Lauren's kids just sat around their mother and just showered her with love and affection. And sure enough, a few days later, when Lauren did kind of come out of it and recover, she would say that she felt herself drifting off towards death. I mean, she really knew she was dying. But then she remembers hearing her kids calling to her and saying how much they loved her and to please come back. We need you. We already lost Dad. We got to keep you. And Lauren would say that's the reason she's still here today, is because she held on for her kids. She felt like it was her duty to be here for her family. And so that's what saved her life. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the MrBallen podcast, as well as Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 3 medical horror stories. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Honking Boy. When a doctor rushes to help a boy who's having trouble breathing, what he ends up discovering about this boy is truly absurd. The second story you'll hear is called Magic Elixir, and it's about a 1900s drink that had very serious consequences. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Shiny But Deadly, and it's about a healthy man who suddenly became extremely sick, and the doctor's only clue was the man's very unusual side job. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please spend many years in medical school becoming a surgeon, and then get a job as a surgeon at the hospital located closest to where the follow button lives. And then eventually, when the follow button goes in for minor outpatient surgery, volunteer to be their surgeon and just give them a full-blown craniectomy. Okay, let's get into our first story called Honking Boy. On November 2nd, 1848, a German doctor named Karl Heinrich August von Bureau was just opening up his private medical practice in East Prussia when a teenage boy burst in through the doors looking totally frantic. Before the doctor could ask any questions, the teenager blurted out that another boy in town needed his help right now. When the doctor asked, what does the boy need? The teenager would say, well, the boy is honking like a goose. For a second, Dr. von Bureau thought this might be a joke, but then he saw the look on the teenager's face, and he could tell he was very upset and very serious, so the doctor grabbed his bag and he ran outside with the teenager, and they hailed a horse and carriage, and they told the driver to hurry up. When Dr. von Bureau and this teenager arrived at the honking boy's house, the honking boy's mother came running outside looking totally flustered, and she flagged down the doctor and then brought him inside her house. And as she led the doctor through the home towards her son's bedroom, she explained what was going on. She said her 12-year-old son had been outside playing with his friends when suddenly he had developed this really intense coughing fit, kind of out of nowhere. And then finally, when the coughing stopped and the boy tried to breathe in, his throat made this horrible honking sound. And so her boy had come in the house honking with every breath. And so kind of in a panic, the mother had opened up her son's mouth and looked inside, but she hadn't seen anything. And she knew her son was not sick. There were no other symptoms really at all that were concerning about her son. It was just that he was honking. Now, for a while, the mother thought this would just kind of clear up, that maybe it was just kind of some byproduct of coughing really, really hard. But now it had been 18 hours and the boy was still honking with nearly every breath, which is why she had finally told the teen to go get the doctor. When the mother let Dr. von Bureau into her son's bedroom and he got a look at the honking boy, he couldn't believe how terrible the boy looked. His face was all swollen and kind of bluish, and he was sweating profusely, and when the doctor watched him try to breathe in, not only did he honk, but also very clearly this boy was really struggling just to breathe. So it was more than the sound, it looked like he was suffocating. And so the doctor rushed over to the boy and told him to open up his mouth. The boy did, and the doctor looked into his mouth, but there was nothing he could see that was blocking his airway. And so the doctor just put his finger into this boy's mouth and he reached down inside, and suddenly he felt something lodged in the boy's throat that was small and hard. And he couldn't quite grab it, so he grabbed his forceps, which are kind of like big tweezers, and he reached back into the boy's mouth, and he tried to grab this object that was clearly obstructing his throat, but the object was too slippery, and the doctor could not pull it out. And so the doctor is looking at this boy who's obviously struggling to breathe, and he's thinking to himself, if I don't get in there and get this obstruction out, this kid is going to die. And so the doctor made a decision right then and there to perform an emergency tracheotomy, which is a surgery where you basically cut a hole in someone's neck in order to create a hole in their throat to let air go in. But in this case, the doctor was just opening up his throat to try to get to this object. And so the doctor pulled out his scalpel and he performed the tracheotomy on this boy. He opened up his throat, and when he looked inside the hole into this boy's throat, he saw the obstruction. It was like this pink, small, hard object. And so the doctor just reached in, scooped it with his finger, and pulled it out. And right away, the boy could breathe again. He was not honking anymore. It was obvious that this fixed the problem, but the doctor and the mother are just looking at this object in the doctor's hand, having no idea how to react to this, because it made no sense. The object that was trapped in this boy's throat, that was making him honk like a goose, was a literal goose's larynx. The larynx is a hollow tube in your throat that helps you make sound. In humans, we call it the voice box. And right before this boy began honking, he was playing a game with his friends that involved taking recently severed goosenecks and blowing through them like they were trumpets. And at some point, as this boy was doing it, he began to cough for some reason. And on the inhale, during one of these coughing fits, he had this gooseneck in front of his mouth. And so when he inhaled suddenly, he inhaled the goose larynx. And so that was why he sounded like a goose. He literally had a goose's voice box in his throat. Luckily, the honking boy would make a full recovery. Our next story is called Magic Elixir. In the early 1900s, Eben Byers was a man who other people envied. He was born into a very wealthy family in New York City. He attended Yale University in Connecticut, which is a very prestigious Ivy League university, and he was devilishly handsome. After his college graduation, he didn't need a job because his family was so rich, and so instead he focused his time on a passion of his, which was golfing. And in time, he became this world-class golfer, going so far as to win the 1906 U.S. Amateur Tournament, which is the biggest amateur golf tournament in the world that most of the winners go on to become professional golfers. And so Eben most likely would have followed that path and become a pro golfer had his father not just handed over the very successful metalworking business that he started that made his family wealthy in the first place. And so Eben stopped his golf career and became the chairman of this incredibly successful company. And so overnight, he basically went from being just rich to being uber rich, making more money than he could possibly spend. But Eben did attempt to spend his money. He pretty much immediately began buying up luxury properties all over the country. He bought horse racing stables in the United Kingdom and in America. And he bought an entire luxury box at Forbes Field, which is where the Pittsburgh Pirates professional baseball team used to play. And so in addition to owning all these incredible things, Eben also, through his role as chairman of this company, began connecting with and befriending very powerful and influential people like the founders and executives at the Coca-Cola Company. And so all in all, Eben's life was really going quite well until 1927. That year, Eben was 47 years old, and he took some time off from gallivanting around the world and rubbing shoulders with famous people to go catch a football game at his alma mater at Yale University. So he hops on a train, he rides to Connecticut, he watches this game, and then afterwards he gets back on the train to head back to Pittsburgh. And this is a very long ride. It's over 12 hours long. And so Eben naturally bought a first-class ticket, and so he was inside of a train car that had bunk beds for passengers to sleep on during the ride. And so Eben climbed into a top bunk and he fell asleep. A few hours later, after the train is well on its way to Pittsburgh, Eben, in his sleep, manages to roll to the side of the bed and actually falls out of his bed onto the ground. He lands hard on his left side, it wakes him up, and as he stands up, he thinks he's okay, but then he feels this shooting pain in his left arm. So he's moving his arm around, he's not really sure what's wrong with it, but he's hoping it's just some bruising, and so he decides to get back into his bunk and just go back to sleep. So he manages to fall asleep despite the pain, and then when they roll into the station in Pittsburgh several hours later, he wakes up and right away he feels that pain in his left arm. And so after getting off the train and going back to his house and dropping off his luggage, he went right to his physical therapist's office to ask him if there was anything he could do to help with the pain in his arm. And so the physical therapist examines Eben's shoulder and determines that, there's no structural damage to his arm, but obviously Eben is in pain. And so he says, look, there's a new product that came online that's quite expensive, but since you're a man of means, maybe it's something you want to consider. It's called Radithor, and it's supposed to dull aches and pains, and it's supposed to give you this huge boost of energy. And so, maybe you want to try that. And so Eben was really excited at the notion of taking this new health tonic and said, yeah, let's do it. And so his physical therapist wrote him a prescription for Radithor. Eben took the prescription and he went to the drugstore. He picked up a half-ounce bottle of this liquid. He went back to his house and, as prescribed, he drank a very small spoonful of this liquid. And right away, he felt this surge of energy, the pain in his arm started to fade. All the things this health tonic claimed to be able to do, it was doing. And so over the next couple of days, Eben very diligently every day took the prescribed amount, a very small spoonful of this Radithor, and every day he felt better and better and better. Not just the pain in his arm, but overall he felt happier, he felt fitter, he felt alive. And he was attributing all those feelings to this miracle tonic. And so he began taking more and more of this tonic, well beyond what was prescribed, to the point where he was drinking 3 full bottles of Radithor every single day. And so for years he did this, and it was all going great until his jaw fell off. Literally, in 1931, one day, his lower jaw just separated from his skull and went slack. And so the reason this happened was because Radithor was actually just radioactive water. In the early 1900s, the radioactive element radium was believed to have highly curative properties with no side effects. And so naturally, at the time, dozens of health products were created with radium being their main ingredient. And Radithor was one of those products. It was literally just water and radium. And so after consuming over 1,400 bottles of Radithor over a 3-year period, Eben's body was finally just starting to disintegrate from the inside out. After he had his jaw surgically removed, along with large portions of his upper jaw, the rest of his body also just began to crumble. And so by the end of 1931, when his story was making headlines all around the world about the dangers of Radithor and really more specifically the dangers of radium, Eben had become completely bedridden and his skull was now beginning to disintegrate. There were holes forming all over his skull that were exposing portions of his brain. And so by 1932, Eben was dead. Eben was buried in Pittsburgh, and he was buried inside of a lead-lined coffin that was designed to absorb any of the radiation emitting from his bones. And then 30 years after he was buried, so in 1965, scientists actually exhumed his skeleton to see if it was still emitting radiation. And they determined it was still emitting the same levels of radiation as when he died. And they actually would ultimately figure out that radium, this radioactive element, has a half-life of 1,600 years. So what that means is Eben's body will remain highly radioactive for centuries. The next and final story of today's episode is called Shiny But Deadly. On the evening of July 3rd, 1992, 35-year-old George Decker was cooking in the kitchen inside of the apartment that he shared with his girlfriend in Jasper, Indiana. And as George cooked, he began to cough. At first, George thought it was just a little tickle in his throat that would go away, but as he continued to cough, this feeling, this sensation in his throat that was making him cough was only getting worse and worse. And this cough was not a normal cough. It was a deep, guttural, kind of rough-sounding cough that really hurt as he did it, and it kind of scared George, like he had never heard himself make this sound before. And in the other room, George's girlfriend, Juanita, she heard this very odd-sounding cough, and so she came out into the kitchen to see what was going on. And when she got there, she found George leaning on the counter, barely able to catch his breath because he was coughing so much. And this was totally out of character for George. He wasn't sick. He didn't have some sort of respiratory problem. He didn't smoke cigarettes. He did work in a metal shop where he melted down aluminum and poured it into different molds. But he always followed all the safety precautions. He wore a mask. He did all the things you're supposed to do to make sure he didn't inhale anything toxic. And so there was really no good reason why George would suddenly be having this unbelievable coughing fit. And so as Juanita kept asking George, hey, are you okay? Can I do anything? George, he can't even talk. He just pulled a handkerchief out of his pocket and he put it over his mouth as he continued to cough. And then when he pulled the handkerchief away, it was clearly covered in blood. Now, George was quick to kind of put the handkerchief back in his pocket, not wanting to deal with the fact that he was coughing up blood. But Juanita, she saw the blood and said, okay, George, I don't know what's going on. You are going to the hospital right now. Now, George, even though he couldn't talk because he was coughing so much, clearly did not want to go, and he kind of resisted Juanita pretty aggressively. He did not want to go, but Juanita finally grabbed him and literally dragged him through the house, out the front door, and down into their car. And then just a few moments later, they were on their way to the hospital located a few miles away. By the time they actually parked in front of the emergency room at this hospital, George's cough had actually died down a little bit. And so now George was being really insistent that it was totally pointless to go to the hospital, that they did not need to be here. Take me back home. This is ridiculous. But Juanita really pressed him and said, you can't goof around with coughing up blood. You have to go in there. And so finally, George, who was totally annoyed by this, relented. He got out of the car, and the two of them walked to the hospital. And then when they went in the front doors of this emergency room, a nurse came up to greet them and see what was going on. And George kind of inexplicably pushed the nurse, like, to get away from me. I don't need your help. And Juanita, she was so embarrassed and tried to apologize, and the staff just kind of rolled with it and just kind of gave him his space. And then for the rest of the time they were there, the staff basically only talked to Juanita, while George sat in the corner with his arms crossed, unwilling to talk or give them any information. Toward the end of this hospital visit, the doctor would prescribe George some antibiotics for what he called an upper respiratory infection, and then the doctor asked George if he was willing to stay the night so they could observe him and make sure he really was okay. But George flatly refused. He got up, turned around, and practically ran out of the hospital. And Juanita said, "I'm so sorry," and she followed after him. Over the next couple of days, George would take these antibiotics that he was prescribed, but they really did not make a difference. He continued to have these huge coughing fits, and even worse than that, something Juanita noticed was George's skin was clearly turning blue, in particular on his arms, his hands, his fingertips, and on his face. And so finally, about a week after that first visit to the ER, Juanita, she looked at George and just felt like he looks so bad. He has to go back. They have to check him again. And so Juanita was able to, again, convince George to go to the hospital. He was very resistant to the idea, but now he was so physically weakened and drained from whatever was going on, he just kind of went with whatever Juanita wanted. And this time, when they went to the hospital, they would give George a chest x-ray, and it would reveal George had pneumonia in both of his lungs. This explained why he was coughing so much, and it also explained why his skin was turning blue. Because of this infection in his lungs, his body was not getting enough oxygen, and when that happens, it leads to a condition known as cyanosis, which turns your skin blue. But when doctors tried to figure out what was actually causing George's pneumonia, they immediately ran into a brick wall. Usually, pneumonia is caused by bacteria, viruses, or some other microscopic invader, and doctors can test a patient's mucus to determine which one it is. But when they tested George's mucus, they couldn't find any evidence of anything that would cause pneumonia. The doctors also ruled out aluminum pollution because he did work in a metal plant and could have been inhaling the aluminum when he melted it down, but he was negative for that. And then also doctors began looking into all these crazy other possibilities like strange fungus that maybe George had come in contact with that caused this, or, very rare viruses and bacteria. But no matter what the doctors thought of, when they tested George, it would come back negative. And so, with the exception of his x-ray that clearly showed he had pneumonia, every other test they ran on George made it seem like he was a healthy guy. And so George would spend weeks in the hospital with doctors and nurses constantly trying to figure out what was wrong with him, but not succeeding. And as each day went by, George's condition got worse and worse until finally he was put on a ventilator because his lungs actually just didn't work on their own. And so a ventilator basically forces air into the patient's body. But no matter how much oxygen they pumped into George's body, he continued to have these terrible coughing fits and his skin stayed blue. Finally, in October, so 3 months after George had first developed this coughing fit, he would pass away. George's doctors were totally baffled. It did not make sense what had happened to George. He was young and healthy, and then something that was totally powerful and aggressive had wiped him out. And so the doctors knew they needed to figure out what that thing was and how to cure it before other people died from the same mystery illness. On October 8th, so 5 days after George passed away, an Indiana pathologist named Dr. Daniel C. Weaver, who was known for his ability to figure out unexplained deaths like George's, was called to the hospital where George died to perform George's autopsy. And when Dr. Weaver began the autopsy and looked inside of George, he could not believe how just absolutely ruined George's lungs were. Healthy lungs are sort of like cotton candy. The tissue is light and airy, which is perfect for transferring the oxygen we breathe throughout our bodies. But George's lungs were thick and heavy, and they were lumpy with scar tissue. They were totally useless. And so Dr. Weaver knew, George basically suffocated to death. But now the question was, why? Dr. Weaver would run into the same obstacles as all the other doctors when he attempted to find contamination inside of George's lungs. There was nothing to see. In fact, at the end of the autopsy, Dr. Weaver had basically learned nothing as to why this happened to George. In frustration, after this autopsy was over, Dr. Weaver went to George's medical records and just began reading through them, and it was at this point that he saw something very odd that other doctors clearly had seen too, but they must have thought it was not important. At that very first ER visit, Juanita had told nurses and doctors that George, before he had begun coughing in the kitchen, he had been in a great mood. And generally speaking, George was just a very positive and upbeat person. But she said once he started coughing, it was like he transformed into somebody else and became mean and nasty, and Juanita had to practically drag him to the hospital. And then also there was a note in the file about how George had walked through the doors and pushed that admissions nurse. And so Dr. Weaver thought to himself, maybe George's belligerence was not just him being a jerk, but maybe he had ingested something toxic that was affecting obviously his lungs and also his brain, and that was causing him to behave this way. And so Dr. Weaver called the manager of the metal shop where George had worked to try to ask him if there were other chemicals or toxins inside of the plant that maybe George had been exposed to. But the manager just did not want to talk about any of that. Instead, he just wanted to talk about basically how awful George was as a person. The manager clearly did not like George, and he began talking about how George was obsessed with making money at all costs, and that in addition to working in the metal plant, George had all these kind of sketchy, kind of borderline illegal side jobs to make more money. And then at some point, the manager just began talking about this one particular potential scam that George was involved in that had to do with little bits of silver and gold. And the doctor at this point is not really even listening. He just wants to get off the phone with this guy because it's obvious the manager is not really trying to help. He's just trying to bash George. But at some point, the manager, in detailing this gold and silver scam, mentioned something that piqued the doctor's interest. And suddenly the doctor was really intently listening to this manager and actually began taking notes and asking clarifying questions about this particular scam that George was apparently involved in. And then when Dr. Weaver hung up the phone with this manager, he felt pretty confident that he had actually figured out what had happened to George. The clues had all been there the whole time. George's blue skin and his rude and violent behavior at the ER, but nobody had put them together correctly because the cause of what was happening to George was so weird, no one would have ever thought of it on their own. On the night that George first began coughing in the kitchen, he was not cooking dinner like everybody assumed. He was actually cooking teeth, like human teeth. The metal shop manager told Dr. Weaver on the phone about the scam that George was involved in that had to do with little bits of gold and silver. And the manager explained to Dr. Weaver that George was going to all of these local dentist offices and he was collecting all of their discarded teeth. What George wanted was teeth that had fillings in them because some of the fillings, especially for older patients, were made from gold and silver. George would then literally cook the teeth until he was able to extract the gold and silver. Now, if he had just been cooking teeth with gold fillings, he'd probably still be alive. But because George also was cooking the teeth with silver in them, during that process of cooking the silver teeth, mercury gas was released and George would inhale the gas. And mercury gas is deadly. And so the gas went into George, it ravaged his lungs, and it also created these massive mood swings and mental disturbances, which explained why he became so nasty and mean when he got to the ER. Also, ingesting high levels of silver, which George was doing as well, can turn your skin blue. So, in the end, George did not die from pneumonia, he died from mercury poisoning. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, not just this one, but also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, and Runfool. Just search for Ballen Studios on any podcast platform, and you'll find all of them. If you want to watch hundreds more strange, dark, and mysterious stories, just head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 3 medical horror stories. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called The Shadow, and it's about how one man's night of terror created devastating ripple effects. The second story you'll hear is called Night and Day, and it's about 2 brothers who suffer from nightly transformations. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Leg Pain, and it's about a seemingly minor issue that would ultimately escalate into one of the most baffling medical mysteries ever. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the Amazon Music follow button is out of town, sneak into their house and prop open their refrigerator door, and then just leave. Okay, let's get into our first story called The Shadow. On the evening of July 25th, 2008, a 59-year-old man named Brian Thomas walked hand in hand with his wife Christine out of the restaurant where they had just had dinner. The couple was in this little village right on the coast of Wales, and where they were now walking outside of this restaurant was right along the water. And so as they did that, Brian found himself looking out over the sea, and he saw the reflection of the moon on the waves, and it was so beautiful. And then he turned to his wife, and she was so stunning. And so Brian finally just stopped and kind of just took in all this incredible beauty right in front of him, and he began smiling ear to ear, which was a big departure from how Brian had been feeling over the past few months. Because Christine had recently had a big scare. She'd been told she might have cancer, and so she went in for all this testing, and then she and Brian had to wait for it to come back, and the wait was absolute torture. I mean, basically Brian and Christine were prepping themselves to find out Christine really did have cancer. But when the results did come back, it would turn out Christine did not have cancer, and so Christine was obviously hugely relieved, but it was actually Brian who was more relieved. It was like he suddenly saw he could lose his wife of 40 years, who he had raised a family with. I mean, this was like the most important person in Brian's life, but it was like he didn't fully appreciate that until he realized he could lose this really important person. And so now that Christine had a clean bill of health, Brian was committed to showering her with love and affection and taking her to restaurants and on vacations. And in fact, the reason they were actually in this village in Wales is because they were on one of Brian's many vacations for Christine. He had gone out and bought this little camper van, and they had driven it up to this part of Wales. And then after this vacation ended, Brian's plan was to use this camper to travel with his wife all over Great Britain. And so the couple had a really busy schedule coming up. But for right now, Brian was focused on just staying in the moment and enjoying this newfound happiness he was feeling. And so he and his wife would continue to just kind of walk along the water for a bit. And then finally, when they felt tired, they headed back to their camper, they went inside, they got in their bed, and they fell asleep. A little before 4 a.m., Brian suddenly woke up inside of this camper. And so he sits upright and he looks around. It's totally dark inside of there. He can't see anything. He doesn't really know why he just woke up. And he's trying to get his bearings. And then as his eyes kind of begin to focus, he realizes there is a person standing inside of their camper right near the door. Basically 10, 15 feet away from he and his wife is a person. And so Brian just froze and he's staring at this person, hoping this is just a dream or something. But then this person, who appeared to be dressed in all black head to toe, began to move. And they began to move first to the left and then towards the bed. And so Brian is still just frozen, thinking, is this real? Is this really happening? And then this person began climbing on the bed on the side where Christine was. And so Brian, without even thinking, just yelled out, "You bastard!" And he jumped off the bed at this guy and began choking them out. And the whole time Brian is screaming at this person, like, "What are you doing? Why are you here?" And this person is fighting back so hard, and Brian is just not letting go. It's like instinct is completely taken over, and then this person goes totally still and just dies. And Brian knows he killed them, but they came into his camper. Like, what do you expect? Brian would ultimately be the one who called the police, and just several minutes later, they would show up, and when they got there, they would find Brian standing outside the camper hyperventilating, and then when they tried to get more information about what exactly had happened inside the camper, Brian basically couldn't explain it. It was like he was totally in shock. And so eventually, one of the officers just went inside the camper, and there on the ground, they would find a body. But it was not some attacker. It was Brian's wife. It would turn out Brian had a medical condition called somnambulism, which we know as sleepwalking. And at home, he would sleep in a different bed than his wife because he sleepwalked so much. But since they were on vacation in their camper, they had to sleep together because there was only one bed on board the camper. And so not long after Brian and Christine had fallen asleep together, Brian began having this really intense nightmare where he believed his wife was being attacked. And so Brian, in this nightmare, had to stop this person from hurting Christine. Except, because of his sleepwalking, he acted this out in real life. And the attacker that he ultimately killed was ironically his wife. He basically tackled his wife and strangled her to death because he thought he was actually saving her. Brian was absolutely destroyed with grief and with guilt, and the second he realized what he had done, he confessed. He didn't in any way try to protect himself. He said, "I did this, take me in." And Brian would be arrested. However, in November of 2009, the judge who actually heard Brian's official confession, he kind of felt bad for Brian and said, "You know what? I'm dropping all charges against you because it's obvious to me you are a good and decent person. This was a mistake. And you're going to live with grief and guilt for the rest of your life, and that's punishment enough." Our next story is called Night and Day. In the late afternoon of May 1st, 2016, 13-year-old Shoaib Ahmed and his 9-year-old brother, Abdul Rashid, chased a soccer ball across a dusty plain near their little rural town in Pakistan. Abdul, who was very athletic and quick on his feet, managed to kick the ball past the defender and then kicked a line drive shot right at the net. But at the last second, the goalie jumped and blocked the shot. And so Abdul threw his hands up in exasperation, but even though he was frustrated he missed a shot, he was having a blast. He loved playing soccer with his brother and the neighborhood kids. But as much fun as he was having, Abdul at some point looked up and he noticed the sun was starting to set behind the mountains. And immediately when he saw that, the expression on his face went completely deadpan. And then he looked over at his brother, Shoaib, who also had noticed the sun was setting. And by this point, Shoaib was already rushing over to Abdul. He grabbed Abdul's hand, and the two brothers, without a word to their friends who were just kind of standing there watching, they took off and just hustled back towards their home. The brothers made it to their home, but on the porch, Shoaib, the older brother, just collapsed onto the ground with his arms and legs going totally stiff and his jaw locking up to the point where he couldn't even speak. And Abdul, instead of trying to help his brother, just stepped clear over him and ran into the house and made it to his bed just in time for him to also collapse, but onto the bed, with his arms and legs being just as stiff as his brother's, and his jaw also being locked so he couldn't even speak. And then moments later, the boy's father would scoop Shoaib off the porch, carry him into the bedroom, and put him in a bed, cover him up. And then the father would rotate Abdul, who was on his stomach, over onto his back, and he put the covers over him. And then the father just left and got into his own bed and went to sleep. And this was a typical night in this family's household. The next day, a convoy of fancy cars descended on this little village where Shoaib and Abdul lived. And in these vehicles were all these scientists from Pakistan's Institute of Medical Sciences, and they had heard about the boy's nightly bizarre collapses, and they wanted to find out if the condition was real. Now, if the scientists had arrived in the village before sunrise, they would have found Abdul and Shoaib still in their beds in a semi-comatose state, unable to move, but it was almost noon by the time the scientists arrived, and so when they saw the two boys, they were outside, goofing around and playing, acting like everything was totally fine. In the village, neighbors referred to Abdul and Shoaib as the solar boys because they were only normal and active and like the other kids during the daylight hours when the sun was up. And then at night, they would become totally paralyzed and mute. Now, the villagers saw this happening, but they didn't really believe it necessarily. They thought maybe the kids were making it up to get attention, or maybe they were doing it as like a grift to get people to donate money to the family. But Shoaib and Abdul's father completely denied this and said they had not made any money from what was happening to his sons, and all they wanted to do was just figure out what was wrong with them so they could help them. The scientists would talk to Abdul and Shoaib's father first, and he would explain to them that really since Abdul and Shoaib were very little, they had been suffering from these nightly paralysis events. And so with the family's permission, these scientists got to work. They collected blood and urine samples, not just from Shoaib and Abdul, but from the entire family. And then also, the scientists tested Abdul and Shoaib's balance and coordination, obviously during the daytime, and the boys both did completely fine. And then as sunset approached, the scientists just stood there and watched as Abdul and Shoaib slowly lost control of their bodies and became paralyzed and mute. And then throughout the night, the scientists just continued to watch them, and the boys did not move at all. And then when the scientists attempted to kind of move their limbs for them, they were so rigid, almost like rigor mortis after you die, that they really couldn't move their limbs at all. And then the next morning, as the scientists were watching, the sun came up, and it was like suddenly Abdul and Shoaib were totally back to normal. They popped out of bed with a smile on their face, able to move around, no problem. And so to the scientists who watched this go on, they were left thinking, okay, there's no way these kids could be faking this. Like, no one could fake this. This is real. But the scientists really didn't have any new information to pass to the family because, the boys' blood and urine samples came back completely normal, and they had passed all of their balance and coordination tests. And so it seemed like, Abdul and Shoaib should be totally normal, healthy boys, but they just weren't, and these scientists didn't know why. Now, these scientists were not the first group of people who had tried to solve the mystery of the solar kids. For years, their father had been trying to find someone who could help them, but he was having no success. Doctors in the nearest hospital to their village were convinced that the boys had a rare illness that made them extremely tired only a couple of hours after waking up in the morning. But Abdul and Shoaib had loads of energy all day long. It was only when the sun came down that they became totally paralyzed, and so the father didn't believe those doctors were really taking this that seriously. The imam at a local mosque was convinced the boys were possessed by demons, and so he organized an exorcism where a group of religious leaders basically tapped on the boys with sticks while chanting in rhythm and dousing them with holy water, but that didn't work. And so the family was close to giving up on ever finding help for their sons, But then in April of 2016, so a month before that team of scientists descended on the village to research the boys, a TV news reporter from Pakistan's version of CNN came to the village to interview the family because this reporter had heard about this strange condition these boys had. And this interview was seen by millions and millions of people, including Pakistan's most esteemed and influential doctor, a man named Dr. Javed Akram, who happened to be the vice chancellor of Pakistan's Institute of Medical Sciences. Dr. Akram had never heard of such a strange condition, and so he was the one who ordered those team of scientists to go to the village and research this family. And after those scientists came back and checked in with Dr. Akram, it was clear they had not had a sort of breakthrough moment with regards to what was going on with these boys, but they were very convinced that this was a real condition. And so Dr. Akram decided that he and his team would just continue to study this family until they figured out what the heck was going on with these two boys. And finally, a year later, in May of 2017, Dr. Akram believed he had figured out what was wrong with them, and he even had a solution. But his solution was so simple that Dr. Akram actually kind of second-guessed himself, thinking, this is too good to be true. So the doctor decided he would run one more experiment just to test his theory and make sure he really was correct. And so Dr. Akram flew Abdul, Shoaib, and their father out to his institute in Islamabad, and that night Dr. Akram watched as the two boys slowly slipped into paralysis as the sun went down. But this time, as soon as the paralysis was clearly beginning, Dr. Akram gave each of the boys a pill. And 40 minutes would go by, and suddenly Abdul, who was totally mute and laying there still, broke into a smile, and then he raised his right leg. And then Shoaib, right next to him, he too smiled and turned his head. And then 20 minutes after that, both boys were up on their feet, totally fine, laughing and joking, because they had never really done anything at night. They were always paralyzed as soon as it started to get dark. It would turn out Dr. Akram and his team had discovered a very strange mutation in Abdul and Shoaib. Our brains naturally produce all sorts of chemicals that keep them running, and one of those chemicals is called dopamine. Dopamine does several things, but one of those things is it controls muscle movement. The mutation that Dr. Akram and his team had discovered was that the boys' genes were mistakenly shutting off dopamine production every single night, and so that was why they were becoming totally paralyzed. This mutation was the result of a series of complex genetic mistakes, but the fix was actually quite simple. The pill that Dr. Akram gave Abdul and Shoaib was just a dopamine pill. And what it did is it basically just turned the boys' bodies back on. And so Dr. Akram and his team had discovered quite possibly the world's rarest disease, only afflicting one family. But fortunately, they had also found the cure too, and so Abdul and Shoaib, from that day forward, lived totally normal lives by taking their dopamine pills every night. The next and final story of today's episode is called Leg Pain. On the afternoon of February 1st, 2013, a retired Army veteran named Robert Smith limped his way into the emergency room at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Washington, D.C. Robert checked in at the triage desk, but then instead of sitting down with the rest of the patients who were waiting, he leaned up against the wall and just grimaced. Robert was in his late 60s, and up until just a few days ago, he felt like he was in the best health he had been in since leaving the service. Robert had gotten a kidney transplant a year and a half earlier, and after getting that operation, he really wanted to make sure he stayed healthy, and so he had been going on regular walks and eating healthy, and so really he was doing great. But a few days ago, Robert had noticed this throbbing pain in his right hip that was shooting pain all the way down his right leg, and he assumed, this had to be from maybe overdoing it on one of his walks. But the pain had continued to get worse and worse over the last few days, and so that was why he was finally here at the hospital. A nurse eventually called Robert's name, and so Robert, he came off the wall and hobbled over to her, and she led him down a hallway into an exam room. Once they got inside the room, the nurse would take Robert's vitals, which were all normal, and then after doing that, she said she was going to go out and get the doctor. A couple minutes later, the doctor walked into the room, and she reviewed Robert's chart and talked to Robert about his symptoms, and then afterwards, she concluded that very likely what Robert had was something called sciatica. Sciatica is pain caused by pressure on the sciatic nerve, which travels from the lower back down each leg. And while sciatica is definitely very uncomfortable and very painful, it's not usually a big deal. And it typically clears up on its own without treatment. And so the doctor told Robert that he should just go pick up some ibuprofen, so over-the-counter pain medication, and take that every couple of hours and just wait for this thing to pass, and then he'd be fine. And so Robert was totally relieved. He thanked the doctor, he thanked the nurse, and then he left and headed back to his home. But despite doing what the doctor said and taking pain meds and just kind of taking it easy, the pain in Robert's leg did not go away. And then on the morning of February 4th, so 3 days after Robert's trip to the ER, he woke up and not only was his right hip and leg still sore, but now when he tried to stand up, he couldn't put any weight on his right leg. It just felt too weak and it was kind of tingly. Something just felt off about it. And also, Robert felt very nauseous. And so Robert told himself that, maybe what was going on here is he was taking too much ibuprofen. And it was upsetting his stomach, and maybe it was also affecting his leg negatively or something. He didn't know. And so that day, he just sat on the couch and watched TV, trying to tell himself that he was okay, it's just sciatica, take a little less pain meds and you'll be okay. But that didn't work, because the next day when he woke up, he was in even worse shape. Now, he not only had this pain and weakness in his right leg, and he had nausea still, but also he now had this new pain in his abdomen that was located right around where the scar was from his kidney transplant, and Robert was also starting to spike a fever. And fevers in transplant patients are a really big deal, because a fever in a transplant patient could mean an infection. People who get transplants are then given medication that keep their bodies from rejecting their new organ or organs. This medication works by basically suppressing that person's immune system. This prevents the body from mistakenly attacking the new organ, but it also means that if their body gets a real infection, they will have a really hard time fighting it off, because again, this medicine is basically stopping the immune system. And so when Robert saw he had a fever in conjunction with these other symptoms that were not going away, he knew he had to go back to the hospital, because obviously this was not just sciatica. Robert was too sick and weak to drive himself to the hospital, so he asked his neighbor to drive him, and as they were driving to the hospital, Robert basically sat in the passenger seat rocking back and forth, not saying anything because he was so uncomfortable, and the neighbor, the whole time they're driving, they just kept looking over at Robert, because not only did Robert look totally miserable, but also Robert was sweating profusely. Like, so much so that it looked like he had just sprinted a 5K. I mean, he was drenched in sweat. And so the neighbor's looking at him thinking, what's wrong with this guy? Finally, the neighbor arrived at the hospital, and Robert, he managed to get out on his own, and he thanked the neighbor, and then Robert hobbled his way back through the doors into the ER. And then a few minutes later, Robert was in an exam room, and his doctor walked in, and she took one look at him and saw how horrible he looked. And without any hesitation, she said, "You're getting admitted right now." It was clear to Robert's doctors that he had some kind of virus or infection that his body was trying and failing to fight off. When they tested his blood, they saw his white blood cell count was elevated, which is a sign that the body's immune system is launching some kind of a response. But the doctors didn't know what his immune system was responding to. Even though Robert had this acute pain in his abdomen around the site of the kidney transplant, his kidneys seemed to be working just fine. And so whatever was going on with him didn't seem to be linked to his transplant. The profuse sweating did seem pretty odd, but considering Robert had a really high fever, it wasn't totally inexplicable. So basically, Robert's symptoms were weird, but kind of generic. They didn't tell the doctors specifically what was wrong with him, they just knew something was wrong. So they just hooked Robert up to an IV and began administering a broad-spectrum antibiotic, which is something that treats a whole variety of different infections. And then after that, the doctors just began testing Robert over and over and over again for all these different things that could be the cause for his illness. But every test they ran came back negative. And at the same time, over the couple of weeks that they ran all these tests, Robert just kept getting sicker and sicker and sicker. His fever wasn't going away, he was still sweating profusely, his blood pressure was all over the map, and he had even begun drooling almost uncontrollably to the point where he didn't even speak because he was so embarrassed about it. But to the doctors, the scariest symptom that Robert was now showing 2 weeks into staying at the hospital was he was starting to act really confused, like he didn't know where he was, he didn't know why he was there, and so that told the doctors that, whatever his body was fighting, it had made its way up into his brain. And so the doctors knew, Robert did not have much time left, but they had tried every test they could think of, and Robert had tested negative for all of them. And so, as kind of like a Hail Mary, because they had nothing to lose, the medical staff decided to just start testing Robert for basically completely random diseases that he almost certainly did not have. But basically, if any of these illnesses had a symptom that Robert had, they would test him for it. And all these tests came back negative, except for one. On February 22nd, so 17 days after Robert had been admitted to the hospital, this test came back positive, and when the doctors saw what he was testing positive for, they immediately assumed this has to be a mistake. There is no way he has that. However, the only way to truly confirm that diagnosis was to literally cut into Robert's brain, which would kill him. And so obviously they were not going to do that. So the doctors basically just had to take this diagnosis at face value, and they tried giving various medications to Robert, but it was obvious none of them were working. And so the doctors felt like there wasn't much they could do, and they just began focusing instead on keeping Robert comfortable. And then finally, on February 27th, so 22 days into Robert's stay at the hospital, he would die from this mystery illness. During Robert's autopsy, the medical examiner was able to perform that test that doctors could not perform on him when he was alive, and that was to cut into his brain. And when the doctor cut into his brain, he saw very clearly, without a shadow of a doubt, that yes, Robert really was positive for that very, very rare virus, and it absolutely is the thing that killed him. But this was not the end of the case, because the virus that killed Robert was not just rare, it was also highly contagious, which meant the doctors needed to figure out how Robert got this virus to protect other people from getting it too. But the staff at this hospital knew they were not equipped to lead this investigation, and so they handed the case over to the Centers for Disease Control, or the CDC, which is the world's leading disease tracking agency. Investigators for the CDC began looking into Robert's case a couple of days later. They sifted through the days and the weeks leading up to Robert's hospitalization in an effort to try to retrace Robert's footsteps to figure out what made him sick. Now, they didn't have any leads. The only thing they agreed on was that very likely, even though Robert had that pain around his scar where the transplant was, that very likely the transplant did not have to do with whatever killed him, because Robert's kidney had been working fine, and his transplant had happened 17 months earlier, and typically complications from transplants will happen much sooner. And so they basically had ruled the transplant out as being the cause. But one of the CDC investigators decided to look into the transplant file anyways, just to see if maybe something got missed, or if maybe there was some detail about the donor that was relevant to what happened to Robert. And so this investigator got the file and began going through it. Robert's donor's name was William Edward Small, and at the time of his death, he was 20 years old and serving in the Air Force. Now, none of that stood out to the CDC investigator, but William's cause of death definitely did. Even though it really did not appear to have a connection to Robert, it was just so weird and unexpected. The CDC investigator would read that back in September of 2011, William was out fishing in the Gulf of Mexico, and he caught a fish, and he ate that fish, and it gave him something called ciguatera poisoning. Ciguatera poisoning is something you get when you eat a fish that contains microalgae toxins. And so William, he ate this fish that was contaminated, and not long after that, he had died. But when the CDC investigator read through all of William's symptoms before he died, they basically exactly lined up with all of Robert's symptoms. William had developed pain and weakness in his extremities. He developed a very high fever. He became nauseous. He also lost the ability to swallow. And then he became totally confused and then died. And so when the CDC investigators saw this incredible coincidence, she knew she was onto something, but first she would need more information about William. And so very quickly, the CDC got in touch with William's family, and they asked them all these questions about William. And finally, after hearing the answers from the family, the CDC finally figured out what actually happened to Robert and what actually happened to William. It would turn out William was not just a fisherman, he was also a hunter and a trapper. And he had a very specific way he would go about training his hunting dogs. He would capture wild raccoons and use them as live bait to train his hunting dogs how to hunt. Now, William was always very cautious with these wild raccoons, but in the year and a half leading up to his death, he was bit 2 different times by raccoons. And it was one of those 2 raccoon bites, not some toxic fish in the Gulf of Mexico, that killed William and killed Robert. William did not die from ciguatera poisoning. He died from rabies, and the rabies virus that was in his kidney was still present when it was taken out of his dead body and transplanted into Robert's body. And so that was how Robert got rabies. Rabies can look like the common flu at first. People feel achy and nauseous, they get fevers, their stomach starts to hurt. Some people affected by rabies will drool uncontrollably, like Robert, or they'll lose the ability to swallow, like William. But for everybody who contracts rabies and who does not get a vaccine right away, because a vaccine does stop rabies in the early stage, so if you don't do that, everybody dies. That's what rabies does to you. It kills you. Now, you'd think, maybe we should be testing organs for rabies before they get transplanted, but you gotta remember that rabies is so rare. Only 1 or 2 people a year in the entire United States will die from rabies. And so it's just not something doctors are gonna screen for because the percentage chance that they could have rabies is basically 0. Ultimately, Robert was not the only person who received an organ transplant from William. There were 3 other people that received his organs. Luckily though, the CDC was able to track those 3 people down, and all of them were totally healthy and not showing any signs of rabies, so either they didn't have it or they were super early stage, which meant they were eligible for the rabies vaccine. They all got the vaccine, and they lived happily ever after. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the MrBallen podcast, and also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.